How do wars break out? In reality, what I will tell you, I believe, is also quite reassuring, in the sense that it shows that wars, great world wars, break out in situations quite different from the one we are experiencing now. Today we are experiencing a disastrous international situation, full of suffering, full of uncertainties, but quite different from the scenarios that were anticipated in Europe. For example, in Europe in 1914, from which we begin this evening, how does World War I break out? Well, in the end, we all know. It starts with an attack, the attack in Sarajevo. On June 28, 1914, a group of Serbian terrorists killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, the first important thing to say about the outbreak of World War I is that it originated from an act of terrorism. And terrorism, both then and today, provoked visceral reactions in public opinion and therefore also in governments. An act of terrorism to us today may seem that killing an archduke is perhaps a somewhat less serious matter than, what do I know, bringing down 2 skyscrapers with 3,000 people inside. And instead, one thing we must have very clear to understand what people were like in 1914 is that for them, at least for the politicians of that time, killing an archduke, heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is a much more serious matter than bringing down 2 skyscrapers, if they could have ever imagined it. Try to think. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is a great power. It is still a weakened great power in crisis. But it is one of the few great world powers. The Emperor Franz Joseph rules over the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Emperor Franz Joseph is 84 years old, which means he will die very soon. No one knows when, but it is certain that he will die very soon. Franz Joseph has reigned for an immemorial time over the Austrian Empire, reigning for 66 years. He will die very soon, everyone knows this. In fact, he will die in December of 16, a year and a half later, this we know. And when Franz Joseph dies, Archduke Franz Ferdinand will become the sovereign of one of the great world powers for his entire life. You understand that killing him changes things a bit. It's not like killing a president of the United States who can easily be replaced after 4 years. Here, you are killing someone who would have contributed to governing the world for his entire life. Therefore, the attack is extremely serious. It is an act of terrorism of enormous gravity and has foreign complicity. Here we must remember how it is. I will spend the whole evening telling you that we must remember this thing. Please excuse me, it's not so simple how a war breaks out. There is a whole series of connections. First, let's focus on Sarajevo. Why Sarajevo? Sarajevo in Bosnia and Bosnia. And so, just like in our time, a delicate place. Even then, Bosnia is a place where there is an ethnic mix with hostile ethnicities. Bosnia has been occupied by the Austro-Hungarian Empire for some years now, and some of the inhabitants are happy. The Croatian population is happy, for example. The Bosniak Muslim population is quite pleased to belong to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Indeed, Bosnian and Muslim soldiers fought faithfully for the Austro-Hungarian Empire in World War I. Even in Italy, these Muslim regiments with their phases. And instead, in Serbia, in Bosnia, there is a percentage of the Serbian population that is not at all happy about belonging to Austria. Because right next to it is Serbia, the Kingdom of Serbia, independent Serbia, small but warlike, a battle-ready state with military traditions and grand dreams of expansion. The Serbs of Bosnia suffer from being under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and therefore there is discontent and there is terrorism. And the Austrians are sure that this terrorism is supported, backed, and organized in Serbia. This attack, in which Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife were killed, was organized in Serbia with complicity from the Serbian government and the Serbian army. The Austrians have been certain of this from the very first day. Among other things, it is true, it will come out from the investigations. There is no doubt there are these complicities in Serbia, and thus Austria is determined to punish Serbia. And here you have to think not of Austria, not of Serbia, states forgotten back then. Who remembers them? No, here is the rogue state that organizes terrorism abroad. And there are those who have suffered from the terrorist attack who are determined to punish the rogue state. In Austria, there is a wave of indignation en masse. The crowds are in the square shouting, "Serbia must die." In German, it also has a resonance. "Serbian must sterben." But there is a problem. Serbia has a great friend. It has a great protector. Russia. The Russia of Tsar Nicholas II. The friendship between Serbia and Russia is one thing. It is an obvious fact of European geography, and it is true even today. Russia is a Slavic Orthodox power, and the Serbs are Slavic Orthodox. Even during the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, Russia supported Serbia. Let's broaden the discussion for a moment. Serbia has a great friend, Russia. Everyone in that world of 1914 is trying to have friends, allies. The weight of alliances is a fundamental aspect to understand why the world slipped into war. Because that is not a world of blocks. Well, it's no longer even ours. Only the American bloc remains. But anyway, we all remember when our world was divided into two blocks and nothing happened outside of those two blocks. The world of 1914 is not like that. It is a world of great and small powers. What are the great powers? England, Germany, France, Russia, Austria, Hungary. Then please also include Italy, usually the last of the great powers with a bit of effort. And then there are the small powers, but they too are warlike, nationalistic, and fierce. Serbia, Romania, Belgium, there you go. They are not divided into blocks. Each thinks for itself. It is the time when nationalism is at its peak. And every country is convinced that it has the duty to think for itself. And this is what an Italian politician, the Prime Minister Salandra, will define as sacred selfishness in those days. However, if one must think for oneself, one must also try to have allies, because going it alone often ends badly. Therefore, each country seeks to have alliances for its own security. Serbia is allied with Russia. The Austrians believe that, in short, the world will understand. Serbia is clearly a rogue state that has organized terrorism and must be punished for the safety of all. However, he indeed doubts that if Austria attacks Serbia, the Russians might intervene. But Austria is also a powerful friend. More powerful than her because Austria is a great empire in decline. After all, everyone somewhat suspects that it is in decline. And instead, Austria is a very powerful friend which is becoming the greatest world power, Germany. Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm. Do you remember Wilhelm with the handlebar mustache and the spiked helmet? But beyond the Kaiser, who is somewhat of a comic figure, Germany is a great power, has the strongest army in the world, and is building the strongest industry in the world. In fact, Germany has already become the largest industrial power, having already surpassed England. Austria is allied with Germany in an alliance that commits both countries to assist each other if one of them is attacked. To tell the truth, the alliance would also include Italy. In fact, it is not called the Triple Alliance for nothing. But in those days of crisis in 14, it is very clear that no one believes in Italy. The Austrians do not believe that if they go to war, Italy will come to help them. They cut it off, they exclude this discussion outright. And indeed, they are right. Italy will decide to stay out for the moment in the name of sacred selfishness. But there is Germany. Austria has enough common sense to know that before doing anything against Serbia, it is necessary to ask what the Germans think. On July 3rd, the funeral of Francesco Ferdinando takes place. The next day, on July 4th, the old emperor Francesco Giuseppe, writes to Kaiser Wilhelm telling him, "Here, this letter from the Emperor of Austria is very interesting. It is not precise, clear, it does not say we want to do this. It is a letter more or less of this kind. Francesco says to Kaiser Wilhelm, "You see it too, that this way we cannot go on. Serbia is a criminal hotspot. It must be punished even if Russia protects it. Don't you agree?" Here, it is a letter that makes me think of the motivations with which the Westerners went to Iraq or Afghanistan after September 11th. In other words, something needs to be done. It's not that there is a clear reasoning about the consequences, what is today called an exit strategy. No. Don't you agree that something needs to be done? Fortunately for Austria, Kaiser Wilhelm agrees. When he received the news of the Sarajevo assassination, Kaiser Wilhelm noted on the telegram that it would really be time to clean up the Serbs. As a result, on July 5th, Kaiser Wilhelm responds to his Austrian colleague, telling him to go ahead, to be at ease, and that if Russia should interfere, Germany stands with you. But the Kaiser also adds, "But really be calm. The Russians will not have the courage to interfere. We are sure Russia will stay out." It's the first bet. Tonight's story is a story of bets, one after another, all wrong. And as it is said, as we will see, wars break out not because someone wants them. No one ever wants war, at least not a world war, a general war. No one ever wants that. Wars break out because someone makes a wrong bet. I pause for a moment on this assurance that Kaiser Wilhelm sends to his Austrian counterpart. Go ahead, we are with you, rest assured. It is a reassurance that historians later called a blank check. How was this blank check given? Germany is already a parliamentary country. There are parties, parliament, and free elections. The Kaiser did not consult anyone. He wrote to his colleague, the Emperor of Austria, to be at ease. Then the Kaiser heard from someone who, not parliament, not at all. He heard from the Chancellor, the Prime Minister, that is. He heard from the army commander, General von Moltke. And General von Moltke told him that if war breaks out, we are ready. And then this is interesting. Who has heard from Kaiser Wilhelm again? He has heard from Alfred Krupp, the great arms industrialist. Krupp is the largest arms factory in the world. The Kaiser felt the need to consult Alfred Krupp. If a war were to break out, are the Krupp industries ready? And Alfred Krupp reassured him, the Krupp industries are ready. However, they are confident that war will not break out, so much so that the Kaiser, after sending a blank check to Vienna, boards his yacht and goes on a cruise in the Baltic. It's July, people want to go on vacation, and Kaiser Wilhelm is also going on holiday. This German bet, yes, there is a risk of war, but you will see that war will not come. This is a crucial aspect of the speech we must make tonight, and therefore I must dwell on this. The bet is an even bigger gamble than it seems regarding the issue of alliances, because at stake is not only Russia. Russia is the great friend of Serbia, but Russia has an alliance with France. It is an unnatural alliance from a political standpoint. If you think about it, France, the secular, anti-clerical, radical republic, is allied with the Tsar's empire, the Orthodox Empire, the most absolutist and reactionary state on the continent. It is an unnatural alliance, and yet for 20 years, France and Russia have been allies. Why? Just look at the map. The map from back then. Today it seems to us that Germany is a great power. The Germany of that time was much larger. Poland did not exist. Czechoslovakia did not exist. The Baltic states did not exist. There was only Germany and at one point, Russia. On the map of Europe from the 14th, there is Germany in the middle, bordering France and Russia. It is therefore clear that France and Russia have every interest in being allies. And the Germans, when they bet that there will be no war, that there will be no world war, that small one between Austria and Serbia, yes, of course, that's fine. It's needed, but when they bet that there will be no war, the Germans are betting that there will be no war against Russia and France because that is the risk. Why do they take this risk? The second part of this speech, of this chat, will be a kind of countdown, the last days. But first we need to outline a broader picture to get into the minds of those people who govern the world at that moment. What is the world like? What is Europe like at that moment? Europe in 1914 is experiencing a phase of great prosperity, of great economic expansion. After the decades of economic crisis at the end of the 19th century, the economy has started to pick up. Everyone is growing. There is even a kind of globalization ante litteram. Today it's easy to find instances of globalization in the past. I have seen all kinds. Even the Roman Empire was a form of globalization. This one from 1914 has the characteristics of a globalization. The economies are interdependent. The stock exchanges are interdependent. The currencies are linked. They are pegged to gold. The Italian lira is worth exactly as much as the French francs. One can travel throughout Europe without a passport, except in Russia. In Russia, a passport is required to enter. But for the rest, this Europe is so interdependent that it seems incredible that a war could break out among these powers. Yet at the same time, all these countries, including Italy, are armed to the teeth. They all have military expenditures at a level comparable to today's American ones. They spend huge amounts on the army and the navy. And why do they do it? They do it because they are afraid of each other. An important aspect of understanding the mentality of the ruling classes of that time is that they are all steeped in a kind of Darwinian ideology, albeit a very simplified one, right? The survival of the fittest, the struggle for survival, the survival of the strongest. They are convinced that states are also in competition with each other in this way. The strongest will triumph. The weakest will be consumed. And since they believe this, everyone wants to be strong. And everyone arms themselves to survive. No one imagines being the aggressor in the future. It is always the others who are the aggressors. We are threatened. We must be strong. We need to have a large army. And since we spend an enormous amount of money on a large army, well, we must anticipate that perhaps sooner or later we will use it. It cannot be ruled out. Indeed, it is quite likely, says someone. Those are years. It's impressive because during those years, books are published that calmly talk about the upcoming war. It's a predictable scenario, part of the horizon. In 1911, a book by a German general, General von Bernhardi, was published in Germany, titled Germany and the Next War. There are 3 years until the First World War. In this book, there are chapters titled The Right to Make War, The Duty to Make War, Dominate the World, or Perish. I gave a German example because German generals are particularly prone to making these speeches explicit, but in reality, similar speeches were made in all countries. And of course, not everyone thought this way. There were also some clear-headed individuals who said, but look, with the interdependent economies we have, going to war among the great powers would be a catastrophe. I will mention another book that was published during those years. These are the books that prime ministers and army commanders read. They had them on their nightstands. In 1910, a book by an English publicist, Norman Angell, titled The Great Illusion, was published. Do you remember the film The Great Illusion? Well, it copied the title from this book, which was very famous in its time. What is the Great Illusion? The author says that the Great Illusion is precisely that of our great powers, which believe that having a large army and preparing to win the next war is a guarantee. It is not so. The next war will be lost by all of us, says this author. The next war will also destroy the victors. It is an illusion to believe that strength will save us. Now, books like this are circulating. Politicians read them. And in Europe in 1914, several politicians were quite convinced that a war among the great powers would indeed be a catastrophe. But the paradox is that these politicians were at the helm of countries armed to the teeth. The scenario of the upcoming war was so predictable that at one point this thing happened. Let me tell you this detail. In London at one point, the British Foreign Minister, Sir Edward Grey, speaking with the German ambassador, Prince Lichnowsky, says to the German ambassador, "Listen to this conversation. If a European war were to break out due to an Austrian attack on Serbia and Russia, driven by public opinion, marched against Austria, thereby forcing Germany to come to Austria's aid, France would inevitably be involved, and no one knows where it could lead." And it is the description of what I'm telling you tonight, the Sarajevo crisis, the crisis of the summer of 14. Only this conversation took place 2 years earlier. In December 12, Grey said these things to the German ambassador. The scenarios are those where a war could break out, and there are few places. The Balkans are a typical place with all the unrest that exists there. Now, starting from the fact that the scenario of the next war is predictable, a divide is created between politicians and the military. Because politicians say, look at this scenario, we must do everything to avoid it. It would be a catastrophe if it were to happen. But the military has another job. The job of the military is to say, and if it happens, what do we do? If it happens, we must be ready. Therefore, the military during those years of great economic growth pressed for all this money, saying, let's use it to be stronger, and the politicians yielded. The years leading up to 14 are years of an arms race in which each country, not because it wants to attack anyone, but because it is concerned for its security, strengthens its army. In August of 13, 10 months before the Sarajevo attack, France passed a law increasing military service, conscription, from 2 to 3 years. Imagine a world where conscription lasts 3 years. What do the Germans say when the French parliament votes on the law that increases conscription? The Germans say, the French want to go to war. They are threatening us. It is a very understandable reaction that political scientists have studied. It is a reaction known as the paradox of security. I want to feel more secure, so I arm myself. My neighbors get scared and feel less secure than before, so they arm themselves too, and so on and so forth. Second to last thing before arriving, returning to Austria, which is deciding what to do against Serbia. Second to last thing, to have a clear picture of that moment. The military does not just ask for more weapons. They also do something else. Their job is to say that if war really happens, we must be ready. Being ready means making plans. In 1914, the great powers have not waged war against each other for a long time. Since the Crimean War and the Franco-Prussian War, almost 50 years have passed. In those 50 years, the general staffs did nothing but only prepare plans. If the war breaks out, that war against that enemy, what do we do? There are plans ready for all possible wars. They are extremely detailed and precise. Every year, they are reopened to specify and adjust a detail. For 50 years, they have been perfected. And there are plans ready for everything. An anecdote in this regard. In November 1913, 8 months before the Sarajevo assassination, the King of Belgium is on a state visit to Berlin. There is a reception. And during the reception, Kaiser Wilhelm points out a general to the King of Belgium and says, "That is the man who will command the march on Paris." The plans are so complete that everything is already decided, even who will command each individual army and so on. Everything is ready if war should come. Finally, one last thing before returning to Vienna, where they are discussing exactly what to ask the Serbs and how to give them a good lesson. One last thing. This arms race of these years has another characteristic that makes it very dangerous. allowing for the prediction of the evolution of the balance of power. Armaments are slow things. A battleship will be ready in 5 years. They increase the conscription service by 1 year, and before one feels it, 2 years pass, and so on. Therefore, everyone is very attentive to us about when we will be at our maximum strength. And Russia, for example, is militarily weak at that moment after the Russo-Japanese War. But it is making huge investments and in a few years will be much stronger. So in this climate, you understand that the military do their job. Their job is to say that if there is going to be a war, we must be ready. And by the way, if there is going to be a war, when is it convenient for us for it to happen? Is it better for us if it happens soon or if it happens later? All the military personnel make these calculations, and then every now and then something changes. Back in April 1914, it was discovered that Russia and England were negotiating a naval agreement. England, I have hardly mentioned it so far, has no alliances. I will return to that shortly. But now it is starting talks with Russia. Do you understand what effect this has in Berlin? In Berlin, they say we already have Russia and France allied against us in the next war, whenever it may come. If England were to ally with them, the situation would worsen for us. These talks between the Russians and the English begin in April. In May 1914, the commander of the German army, von Moltke, declares, privately and not publicly, that from this moment on, every day of delay can only decrease our chances of success. A few weeks later, on June 1st, 1914, von Moltke declares, now we are ready, and the sooner the better. There are 4 weeks left until the Sarajevo assassination. Did von Moltke organize the Sarajevo assassination? No, evidently. It is the catalyst that brings out all these things that have been simmering for years. Let's return to Vienna, where they are preparing the ultimatum to send to Serbia. They will send a very harsh ultimatum because the Austrians do not want the Serbs to accept it. The Austrians want war and have a blank check from Germany. It will be a very heavy ultimatum. The Germans are pressing Vienna, saying to hurry up and put the world in front of a fait accompli. The sooner you act, the better it is. The Russians will not dare to intervene. But Austria is a country where things are done slowly. It is a country where things are made with slowness. There are 2 governments, the Austrian and the Hungarian, and they need to come to an agreement. And then the Austrian army is a slow, backward army. It takes a long time to prepare. Moreover, think about it. Something that no one would consider today. It's July, it's harvest time. The soldiers are all at home on leave. Austria is an agricultural country. Harvesting wheat takes time. The Austrians are not in a hurry. In Berlin, they are restless. We are always trailing behind this backward country. Finally, on July 23rd, almost a month later, the Austrian ultimatum is ready. It is delivered to the Serbian government. It is a very harsh ultimatum. The Austrians tell Serbia that the Serbian government has done nothing to prevent the proliferation of terrorism. Serbian officials are allegedly involved in the Sarajevo attack. Therefore, we Austrians want the Serbian government to publish a statement disassociating itself from any form of hostility towards Austria. The Serbian government will have to close all newspapers and dissolve all associations that spread hatred against Austria. The Serbian government will have to dismiss all public officials and officers who are in any way involved with acts of hostility against Austria. He will have to arrest these people. The Austrians present the list, and he will have to open investigations into terrorism on Serbian territory, in which Austrian investigators will participate. On July 24th, capitals around the world wake up to the news of this ultimatum, and the ultimatum is received very poorly. In St. Petersburg, the Russian foreign minister summons the Austrian ambassador and asks him, "Do you want to go to war with Serbia? It is the Germans who are stirring you up. You are setting fire to Europe. You are taking on a serious responsibility. For the Russians, the responsibility lies with Vienna and the Austrians. We will see a whole series of these statements. You take on the responsibility. This is just the first. Even in London, the Foreign Minister Grey is astonished. He calls the German ambassador Lichnowsky and tells him, "I have never seen a state send such a document to another state. It is impossible for the Serbs to accept it." Here is a small detail of the time, right? To give a sense of the era. Prince Lichnowsky, the German ambassador, says, "Of course, the language of the ultimatum is a bit harsh, but you understand it is directed at a Balkan people, not at a civilized people. The Balkan peoples cannot be considered with the same criteria as the civilized cultures of Europe." Now we are in London, therefore, in this exchange of remarks between Grey and Lichnowsky. What is happening in London? In London, the Germans' gamble seems to be holding for the moment. Public opinion in England is completely indifferent to Serbia. England has no alliances with anyone. There has been a friendship with France that has lasted for years, it must be said. The English and French military are used to consulting each other. They have even prepared plans together. They have made quite a friendship, but there are no obligations. There are no treaties. At that moment, England is an isolationist country. England is a country that dominates the world, with India, Africa, colonies, trade, and the stock market. And it does not care about small continental disputes, especially those in the Balkans. The English newspapers in those days write, "But why should we get dragged into someone else's war?" There is a newspaper in Manchester that features an article with the theme, "Just as little Belgrade cares about Manchester, equally little does Manchester care about Belgrade." The evidence that England was completely outside of these thoughts until that moment is found in the minutes of the English government meetings from the day of the Sarajevo assassination, June 28th, to the day when the whole world was in an uproar because the Austrians delivered the ultimatum to Serbia, July 24th. For almost a month, the English government never discussed foreign policy. They have their own problems. They have Ireland, which is not yet independent, where there is terrorism, there is everything, a revolution about to break out. Foreign policy does not exist for the English. There is indeed only an individual in England who thinks differently. There are some officials in the Foreign Office. We know this from the notes exchanged during those days. There are some officials in the Foreign Office who are afraid of what is happening. And again, the paradox of security. We are quite safe. Germany is becoming very strong. Germans say they do it only because they are afraid of us. But if they become too strong, then some other official in the Foreign Office in London during those days says, "We must stand with the French and the Russians, because this struggle is not for the possession of Serbia, but between a Germany that aspires to political dictatorship in Europe and the powers that want to remain free." And then there are those who think this way in England, and they are the military. The military have become accustomed to considering themselves friends of the French, to doing things together with them. They know that it will be difficult for England to go to war with France because public opinion does not want it. And they have been mulling over this for years. It is also impressive to see how for years and years they have thought, discussed and reasoned among themselves about when the next war will come. What should we do? There is a revealing anecdote from 1910 about an English general, Wilson, who is very friendly with the French. He is talking to a French general, Foch, and Wilson tells him, "Well, if war breaks out, assuming we come to help you, I hope so, but who knows?" And Wilson says, "But what would be the minimum number of English soldiers that could really be of help to France? We are 4 years earlier, it is in 10. What would be the minimum number of English soldiers that could be of help to France?" And Foch replies, "One single English soldier, and we will make sure he is killed." Because what matters is that public opinion in England is mobilized for a cause. It's almost midnight. Let's start the countdown. On July 25th, the Serbian response to the ultimatum arrives. The Serbs accept almost all the conditions. Meanwhile, Serbia appeals to the Tsar to ensure that the Tsar of Russia will support them if they are attacked. The Tsar responds to the Serbs, "You can count on us." That day, the Tsar makes a symbolic decision. Even symbolic things matter in politics. All final year officer cadets in Russia are promoted to officers on the same day, at the same hour, the hour when the Austrian ultimatum to Serbia expires. It couldn't be clearer than that. July 26th, Austria rejects Serbia's response. By rejecting the response, it means that it will go to war. That day, something happens in London. It's a detail. I have filled this lesson with details, which means I will be late. You will have patience. I did not have the courage to cut so many things. This detail seems to me. It seems to me a detail that is curious in its own way. On the day Austria rejects the Serbian response, the English Minister of the Navy, the First Lord of the Admiralty, takes a decision on his own initiative. The English war fleet is engaged in large maneuvers, fully assembled with complete crews. The large maneuvers end tomorrow. After that, the teams return to their respective ports and the sailors go on leave. The First Lord of the Admiralty orders this on his own initiative. The fleet will not disband. It stays together, moving to the warport. Scapa Flow, Orkney safely. I tell you this, also because the First Lord of the Admiralty in 1914 was Winston Churchill, whom we tend to associate more with World War II, and he was still alive when I was a child, as many of you remember. However, few recall that Churchill was quite precocious. He was a precocious young man and was already the Minister of the Navy in 1914. It is he who decides that the war fleet will not be disbanded but will remain ready and, in fact, will take shelter in the warport. The day after, the German stock market crashes. The news from London is enough to raise doubts. Perhaps England will not stay out after all. There is still one thing I need to explain to you in order to clarify what influences are at play on these military and political figures. And the last thing, I hope it interrupts our countdown. At this point, war is certain. At least between Austria and Serbia, it is certain. Then we will see. In order to go to war, these countries must first officially decree mobilization of their armed forces. What does that mean? They are conscripted armies, which means that the country is full of boys and men who have served in the military in previous years and who can always be called back if war breaks out. In fact, it is certain that they will be recalled. If war breaks out, the army will immediately be expanded, doubled, tripled, calling all those who are at home. This is mobilization. It is an extremely complex matter because you understand it involves calling up millions of men, outfitting them in uniform, arming them, organizing the units, and putting them on trains that will take them to the border. All according to plans, even those meticulously calculated. The German mobilization, calculated to the minute, involves the simultaneous movement of 11,000 trains. The Germans are used to doing these things well. Everything is planned down to the minute. Mobilization, as you understand, is a very heavy decision. Among other things, it costs a lot of money, so no one does it unless the situation has become very serious. But there are differences between one country and another. There are countries that are slow to mobilize. One randomly, Russia. Russia, which is vast and has few railways. Russia takes months to mobilize the army. Therefore, if the situation becomes serious, Russia must mobilize a bit quickly. It cannot afford to wait. Indeed, the first country to start talking about mobilization on July 26th is not Austria. That is about to go to war with Serbia, but Serbia is small, and there is no need to mobilize the entire army against Serbia. The first country to start talking about mobilization is Russia, which knows that it will take a long time. Instead, there is a country in Europe, now let's see if you can guess which one, that is sure to mobilize very quickly. The plans are very precise. to the point that they have already decided that if they mobilize, it is because there is a war. There is no space, no difference between the two decisions. If they mobilize, they might as well go to war right away, right away, right away. You all understand, it's the Germans. So, on the same July 26th, when Austria rejects the Serbian response, although very moderate, to the ultimatum, the German Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, warns the Russian government. And he says to him, be careful, as if Russia mobilizes, it threatens us. But if we are threatened, then we must mobilize as well. But look, if we Germans mobilize, it means war. But we cannot indeed admit that Russia truly wants to unleash such a European war in any way. And two, for the Germans, the responsibility lies with the Russians. It is the Russians who must decide to take a step back and not mobilize. July 28th, a twist of fate. The emperor returns from the cruise and is presented with the Serbian response to the Austrian ultimatum. And the emperor says, well, this is exactly what we wanted, in fact, even more. The Serbian response eliminates every reason for war. The joy of the emperor when he discovers this is the first symptom that the Germans, even though General von Moltke said 2 months ago that now we are ready, saying it in theory is one thing. Now that it is really happening, symptoms begin to appear that even the Germans are not so sure they want to go to war. The emperor is happy. The Serbian response puts everything in order. No war. Unfortunately, on that very day, Austria declares war on Serbia. The Germans have done nothing but insist. Once again, we must understand the people of that time. There is such popular mobilization in Austria. The people are convinced, let's go punish these terrorists who threaten the world. There is such a, let me give you an example. Sigmund Freud. Freud, who is Austrian, lives in Vienna. He is 58 years old, already a mature man, and has lived his entire life in the Austrian Empire. Freud. When Austria declares war on Serbia, Freud says, I don't know anymore, but in any case, it is confirmed that for the first time in 30 years, I truly feel Austrian. For the first time, I think that this empire might have a future. And then this is really a quote. All my libido is directed towards Austria-Hungary. This was on July 28th. On July 29th, Russia begins mobilization preparations, which is exactly what the Germans had told them not to do, because otherwise it would mean war. Russia mobilizes because it is afraid, and even the Russians do not want to go to war. As revealed by another episode that begins on this July 29th, which is very curious, and also typical of this strange era, because Europe during these years is truly strange, suspended between modernity, parliamentary democracy, and liberalism. And the archaism of these dynastic empires where emperors and kings still hold power. On July 29th, the story of the telegrams from Nicholas to William and from William to Nicholas begins. It begins with a telegram from Tsar Nicholas of Russia, who on that July 29th sends a telegram to Emperor William, against whom he is about to mobilize the army. Tsar Nicholas sends a telegram to the emperor in English, which is also very significant, as it gives an idea of what England has become. 50 years ago, if a Tsar had to write to a king of Prussia, he would write in French. Now, however, they speak and write to each other in English. Keep in mind to appreciate the situation that Tsar Nicholas, Emperor William, and King George of England are indeed first cousins. They are first cousins, all grandchildren of Queen Victoria. Remember Queen Victoria from the 19th century, who died in 1900? Well, they are all her little grandchildren. They are first cousins. They address each other informally, and they call each other by diminutives. Thus, on July 29th, Tsar Nicholas of Russia sends a telegram to the emperor saying, I am glad you have returned from the cruise. The moment is serious, and I need your help. A disgraceful war has been declared against a weak country. Lazaro obviously sides with Serbia. In the name of our old friendship, I ask you to do everything you can to stop your allies, namely the Austrians. Signed, Nicky. The emperor responds, replying the same day in English, saying, but look at it from the other point of view. Serbia has been a terrorist, Austria has been in the right, and so on. Come on, you Russians need to take a step back. Signed, Willie. For 4 days, a dozen telegrams are exchanged, Nicholas to William and William to Nicholas, until August 1st, when William declares war on Nicholas. Anyway, let's not rush things. We still have 4 days to sort everything out. On July 29th, the Germans are furious at these stupid Russians who do not understand that by mobilizing, they provoke war. General von Moltke, Russia has aligned itself with a criminal country, a den of terrorists. Thus will indeed begin the mutual tearing apart of the European civil states. A war, it is always General von Moltke that will annihilate the civilization of almost all of Europe for decades. But this war must happen anyway, because no one wants to back down. Here, a nearly schizophrenic trait of this ruling class emerges, which clearly understands that this war will be a catastrophe. Yet at the same time, they cannot back down and lose face. Let others take a step back. Not us. In Germany, there is a further split at this point between the military and the politicians. The military says that war is inevitable, so let's do it right away. Let us attack, give us the order for mobilization. The politicians say, wait a moment, because from the politicians' point of view, it is essential to show that it is not Germany that is to blame for the war. It is entirely the fault of the Russians and the French, not Germany. So, why do German politicians care so much about this? For many reasons, perhaps also to save face, for self-esteem, for a sense of honor, but ultimately they care about German public opinion. Public opinion also matters in Germany. There is a huge socialist party in Germany. What will the socialists say? If people think we have been attacked, then there will be no problems. In fact, that is exactly what will happen. Germany delays mobilization, and the German population will go to war convinced that innocent Germany has been attacked and that it must therefore be defended. And then it is necessary to prevent England from entering the war. If England sees that Germany is doing everything to avoid it, perhaps the war will stay out. After all, it has been understood that the English would like to stay out if they can. But there is another problem that makes it very difficult for the Germans to keep England out of the war. And the last, how shall I put it, problem that I pull out of the hat, Belgium. You might say, what does Belgium have to do with it? It does. Belgium is a small neutral country that enjoys a guarantee signed by all the great powers, including Germany and England, ensuring that Belgium will always remain neutral. And this is something that matters a lot to the English, because in their vision of Europe, Belgium, with its ports facing the Channel, particularly Antwerp, is a fundamental link for England. We English could argue with France, it doesn't matter. As long as there is Belgium, we have a connection to Europe. So the English don't care at all about Serbia, but they would care about Belgium. And why should the Germans be concerned about Belgium? According to the plans, because the German General Staff has a perfect plan to wage war against France and Russia and win it in a few weeks. Everything is calculated. The Russians are slow. Therefore, we are sending the entire army, the famous 11,000 Damascus trains, against France. We invade it and just end the war in a few weeks. To invade France and bypass the French army, for entering into these strategic considerations, the German military has decided that it is necessary to go through Belgium. It is the famous Schlieffen Plan that some may remember, perfected over many years. The German military says, if you want us to win the war, this is the plan. We must go through Belgium. It is up to you politicians to see how to handle the matter. On July 29th, the Kaiser and the German Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, realized that if the bet is for England to stay out of the war, they need to understand how to deal with the issue of Belgium, because we Germans will invade Belgium. It has already been decided. So on July 29th, the Kaiser and the Chancellor make a crucial decision, which will later be unanimously judged as the stupidest decision the Germans made during those days. They write to London to the English government assuring, first, that in this war, if there is a war against France, the English can rest assured that Germany has no territorial aspirations. We do not want to take any pieces of France, so we do not want to disturb the European balance. Secondly, the Germans assure the English government that if during the war they are forced to invade Belgium, they will clear it out at the end of the war. And if the Belgians behave well and do not show hostility, they will also pay them damages. And finally, the Germans write to London that after all, let's think about it a little more, because we Germans and you English could still come to an agreement. Together we are very strong, we divide the world. What do you care, you who are friends with France? What do you care about Belgium? Let's divide the world among us. In London, they see this message arrive and are left astonished. If a high-ranking official from the Foreign Ministry comments on these surprising offers, they deserve only one comment. They cast a very poor light on the statesmen who formulated them. Moreover, the English say, how can they be telling us that they will invade Belgium? They have even put it in writing. Grey calls the German ambassador, Prince Lichnowsky, and tells him that if war breaks out, they cannot remain outside of it. And at that point, they will also enter the war alongside their friends. Grey also says something that everyone is repeating these days, almost obsessively. If war breaks out, it will be the greatest catastrophe the world has ever seen. However, England cannot make this agreement with Germany. Betraying its friends would be an indelible shame. So, think carefully about it in Berlin. And 3, for the English, the responsibility for everything lies in Berlin. It is in Berlin that they must take a step back. In response to the news from London, the German reaction is uncontrolled. The Kaiser notes on the communication, Grey is certainly a vulgar scoundrel. The English are undoubtedly rogues. England now takes full responsibility of a world war. And for the Germans, the responsibility lies with the English. On that day, July 29th, the German ambassador in Brussels, von Bellows-Alesch, receives a sealed package from Berlin with the order not to open it until new telegraphic communications arrive. Another useless detail, but since we're here, I'll inflict it on you anyway. Von Bellows-Alesch is a career diplomat who has a habit of joking that he brings bad luck. He was in China when the Boxer Rebellion broke out. He was in Turkey when the Young Turks Revolution broke out. But then he says, now I am calm, I am in Belgium. Nothing will ever happen in Brussels. Let's hurry up, otherwise I'll keep you up all night. During the night between July 29th and 30 in Berlin, they don't go to sleep because the news from London has thrown them into a panic. It is coming out that England will enter the war. On July 30th at 3 in the morning, Bethmann Hollweg, the German Chancellor, calls Vienna and says, but didn't you understand anything? Do you really want to go to war with Serbia? Take it easy, slow down. Germany does not intend to be dragged into a senseless war because of Austria. Imagine the expression on their faces in Vienna, where until the day before the Germans were telling them to go ahead. So now the responsibility lies 5 with the Germans, and it is now in Vienna. However, in the meantime, we are now at July 30th. After completing the preparations, which take a few days, on July 30th, Russia orders general mobilization. In Berlin, the military goes to the government and says, oh, let's mobilize too, right away. The government replies, let's wait another day because maybe in Vienna they can come up with something. On this day, July 30th in Berlin, the crisis between the military and politicians approaches, I wouldn't say a coup d'etat, but certainly high treason. That afternoon, an afternoon newspaper was published, as there were afternoon newspapers in Germany at the time, announcing the mobilization order. It's not true. The newspaper is seized. And then it is discovered that it was the general staff that leaked the false news to put the government in a position of having to act. General von Moltke calls his Austrian peer the Austrian commander Conrad. Austria has not yet mobilized, among other reasons, because Austria does things so slowly that it has not yet mobilized. And Moltke says to Conrad, mobilize immediately, because if you mobilize, we will have to mobilize as well. In short, the German military is doing everything to force the government to mobilize, but the government is still holding firm, although it is in total panic. That day, another characteristic aspect of the communications from those very last days emerges. The feeling that everyone has that something is happening which no one wanted and that can no longer be prevented. At the Council of Ministers, the German Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, says, all governments, including the Russian one, and the majority of peoples were peaceful for themselves, but the stone has begun to roll. Here is a beautiful declaration of surrender of politics. The stone rolls, and we no longer know what to do. That day, the New York stock market crashes. On July 31st, due to the time zone difference, news arrives from New York in the morning, and the London stock market crashes. They close it at 10 in the morning to limit losses. Germany is still not mobilizing, but sends an ultimatum to Russia. Have you started mobilization? Suspend it. If you suspend it by midnight, good. Otherwise, it is war. In London on July 31st, Grey, the foreign minister, is now convinced that war is inevitable and that England must enter. But he is in the minority in the government. The government continues to say that they have nothing to do with it. Grey does what he can, sending a telegram to Paris and one to Berlin, asking for the guarantee that Belgium's neutrality will be respected. The French respond within an hour, while the Germans do not respond. August the 1st, Grey speaks to the government, describing Germany as a dangerous aggressor akin to Napoleon, and implies that he will resign if England does not enter the war. But the majority of ministers are opposed. The majority of ministers threaten to resign if war is declared. Outside the door is the French ambassador Cambon, who is waiting, and for all those days he has done nothing else. You understand the job of the French ambassador in London during those days? To assure us that since war is about to break out, the English will enter the war with us, as we are such friends. Grey is forced to go out and tell Cambon that there are no guarantees. The government is not conceding anything. Cambon enters the office of a friend, there at the British Foreign Office. The friend describes him as pale as a rag, on the verge of bursting into tears. The French ambassador collapses into a chair and tells his friend, "They are abandoning us." Meanwhile, everything is falling apart. On that 1st of August, Germany declares war on Russia. It is the first declaration of war among great powers. Why does Germany declare war? Because it is the practice. We sent the ultimatum. We told the Russians to suspend by midnight. The Russians did not suspend. Therefore, we must declare war. The night before, the ministers gathered at Batman Hollweg's house to draft the declaration of war against Russia. The Minister of the Navy, Tirpitz, said, "But why do we have to declare war? If we have done everything to avoid giving the impression that we are the aggressors, why should we declare war ourselves?" They respond that the technicians from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said that this is how it is done. That is the practice. You sent the ultimatum, and after the ultimatum, you must declare war. On the same day, August 1st, at 4 in the afternoon, Germany declared war on Russia and ordered general mobilization. For them, it is really the same thing, but there is still room for a comedy, a grotesque misunderstanding. At 5 in the afternoon, a telegram arrives in Berlin from the ambassador in London, Prince Lichnowsky. Lichnowsky says, "I have to see Grey, the British foreign minister, shortly. He summoned me this morning. It seems to me that indeed England wants to propose an agreement. If we commit to not attacking France, then both England and France also commit to remaining neutral." The telegram arrives in Berlin and causes pandemonium. The Kaiser and Batman Hollweg, the Chancellor, say, "Fantastic. We must no longer wage war against France and Russia, only against Russia. If England and France stay out, we are fine. We just need to change the mobilization orders, everything against Russia." They call General von Moltke, who is in command of the army organizing the large mobilization. 11,000 trains have already set in motion. At that precise moment, telegrams with secret orders arrive at all the stations and barracks in Germany. Everything is set in motion. They recall von Moltke to the imperial palace. I have to tell you this about von Moltke. He is not a great general. They will soon remove him from command. He is there mainly because he is the nephew of a great man. In the 19th century, there was another von Moltke, a very famous Prussian general who won all the wars. Here, von Moltke is the young man. He is there mainly because he is the nephew of that great uncle, but he is a man with somewhat fragile nerves. He arrives at the imperial palace and is told, "Look, a telegram from London, probably England and France are staying out. Fantastic. Change the mobilization orders, everything against Russia." Von Moltke has an accident, starts crying and declares that it cannot be done. Everything is already in motion. 11,000 trains, millions of people, all calculated to the second. They insist it cannot be done. Moltke, who I repeat is on the brink of collapse, will return home that evening and have a heart attack. But he holds firm and says it cannot be done. The Kaiser tells him, "Your uncle would have given me a different answer." Moltke is a finished man. However, the mobilization cannot be changed, so everything continues according to plan. That evening, the Germans invade Luxembourg, the first step for the invasion of Belgium. However, before invading Belgium, they need to follow the proper procedures and give an ultimatum. On August 2nd, in Fombello, Usaleska, Brussels, the telegram arrives. It opens the sealed package and brings the ultimatum to Belgium, pretending that it has just arrived, although it has been there for several days. But the ultimatum to Belgium tells the Belgians it is a pile of lies. Here begins another aspect. I am finishing, but it is the last somewhat grotesque aspect of this situation. You have seen how complicated and at the same time frighteningly simple the path to war is. With all this, the Germans remain convinced that in order to send an ultimatum or declare war on someone, one must have pretexts, excuses. And so they tell the Belgians, "We know from a reliable source that France is about to invade Belgium. We Germans, you understand, for our security, we must also come to Belgium, but we would not want the Belgians to interpret it as an act of hostility. If Belgium remains neutral and behaves well, the Germans will evacuate it at the end of the war. Promised." The Belgians decide to resist. That evening in Berlin, at the home of Batman Hollweg, the declaration of war against France is being prepared. Admiral Tirpitz says, "But why must we declare war on France as well? Let's wait for them to declare it on us." They explain to him that according to the rules, this is how it must be done. The declaration of war on France is also a pile of lies. French planes flew over Germany, dropped bombs and killed civilians. Therefore, France went to war on its own, and so on. Clearly, even when pursuing a policy of power, there is this need to cling to something, perhaps for public opinion. It reminds me of Colin Powell at the UN with the test tube of Saddam Hussein's biological weapons, but anyway. That evening, August 2nd, in London, Grey learns of the German ultimatum to Belgium and finally extracts the order for mobilization from the English government. Several ministers resign. That evening, an American diplomat in Brussels notes in his diary, "How strange, just a few days ago, there was so much talk about Serbia. Now no one is talking about it anymore. It's as if everyone has forgotten it." August 3rd, and we are really at the end. Germany declares war on France. Grey finally extracts from the House of Commons the first parliament that gets involved and takes action. In this crisis that has been entirely managed by the governments and sovereigns, Grey secures from the House of Commons the authorization to send an ultimatum to the Germans. If they invade Belgium, it is war. On August 4th, the Germans invade Belgium. The English ambassador arrives with the ultimatum from Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg, unaware that the Germans have already begun the invasion of Belgium that morning. And the entire story concludes, as does this account of mine, with two famous phrases. One very famous, one a little less so. The famous phrase is that of the German Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg, who, when the English ambassador arrives with the ultimatum, has a scene. And he says to him, "But how, you English, a Germanic people just like us, strike us in the back in this way, but for what? But for the guarantee we had given to Belgium of its neutrality. Are you doing this to us? Are you taking on these responsibilities, one solidarity and all for a piece of meat?" Which is a phrase that has indeed gone down in history as an emblem, let's say, of this policy that thinks it can sign treaties and then, well, if one wants, pretend that they don't exist. There you have the treaties. The other historical phrase is a bit less historic, but it is from the Kaiser, who, let us remember, was a cousin of the King of England and the Tsar, and they all called each other by nicknames and addressed each other informally. And when it is obvious at this point that there is war against Russia, against France, and also against England, and they are all grandchildren of Queen Victoria, do you remember the Kaiser declares, "Who would have thought that George and Nicky were about to betray me? If my grandmother had been alive, she would have never allowed it." Thank you and good night to everyone. See you tomorrow. Well, good evening. Tonight we have a journey ahead of us, shall we say, a tough one. You will say, even last night it was no joke, but this evening the purpose of the Second World War is not a cheerful story. The only cheerful note indeed is Italy's participation. Whatever one may think of Mussolini, Galeazzo Ciano and so on, the only comedic note during those rather dramatic weeks was provided by them, as you will see. So, how did the Second World War break out? Well, it has been written that in reality the Second World War broke out in 1919 when the Treaty of Versailles was signed. The Treaty of Versailles, which indeed ended the First World War, significantly created a multitude of dissatisfaction and frustration. Do you remember that even Italy, which had gained Trento and Trieste and had taken South Tyrol, was not satisfied? In fact, we used to say the mutilated victory. Even the victorious Italy then almost sank into civil war, dictatorship, as a consequence of that war that ended badly. Imagine the countries that lost. Germany, which lost, emerged from the First World War, from the Treaty of Versailles, frustrated with the feeling of having suffered an injustice. What injustice? Meanwhile, Germany had to cede territories to a new country. The Treaty of Versailles created many new states, including Poland. And Germany has ceded to Poland, has had to cede to Poland, a large piece of territory inhabited by Germans. Moreover, unmanageable situations have arisen. There was a city which today no one cares about anymore. It is Gdansk in Poland, and we haven't heard much about it since the times of Lech Wałęsa. Back then, however, it was widely discussed. Danzig, a major port and an important German city, is located on the border between the new Poland and Germany. Both claim it. The victors of Versailles decide, well, let's create a free city, independent, neither German nor Polish. The city of Danzig is entirely inhabited by Germans who would like to be with Germany, but they are not allowed. And in Germany, a public movement immediately begins, somewhat comparable to what was happening in Italy before the war. Trento, Trieste, Irredentism, the separated brothers. In Germany, they fight Gdansk, Gdansk and German, Gdansk Deutsch, Gdansk and German, and they didn't give it to us. It's a shame. We will have to revisit this one day. But then there are other problems that arose from the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was dissolved. Many new states were born. Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. With many problems, Austria is small, and it is entirely inhabited by Germans. The majority of them would have liked, well, since it ended the way it did, to become part of Germany. We are Germans too in Austria. But the victors did not want it. Austria must be independent. And then Czechoslovakia is the state of the Czechs and Slovaks. But in those regions, at the time of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there were a lot of Germans, that is, Austrian citizens of German language. Now there are Czechoslovak citizens, but they do not feel Czechoslovak. So there is this set of problems created by Versailles, which are also understandable problems in themselves. They are largely issues of minorities abroad. Tonight I will have to talk for a while about the remote causes of World War II. I would have liked to tell you, very well, we are at August 10th, 1939. This is happening, we will do it. But first we need to talk a bit about these remote causes, because otherwise we won't understand anything. And so, the remote causes are those that I have mentioned. A Germany that emerges frustrated with a series of claims towards Poland for Gdansk, towards Austria because the Austrians are all Germans and it is not understood why they should not be part of Germany, towards Czechoslovakia for the Germans living there who feel discriminated against. In 1933, the Nazis won the elections in Germany and Hitler came to power. And Hitler comes to power with a program that includes many nice things. But the thing that the Germans perhaps feel the most is that we must revise the Treaty of Versailles. We must revise the Europe that came out of Versailles. It is an unjust Europe. It is an inequitable treaty. Germany has suffered, and it is not right. We must revisit this. modify the borders. Here is the story of how World War II broke out, and ultimately, it is the story of a double illusion. One is the illusion of the great democratic powers, England and France. The illusion that it was possible to also satisfy Hitler, because after all, Hitler was right about certain things. The illusion that one could say, all right, let's negotiate, let's find an agreement, Gdansk, here we go, without causing major upheavals. An illusion, as we will see. The other illusion is Hitler's illusion that it is possible to regain everything and even more, and to transform Germany again into the great power of Europe without anyone seriously opposing it. The illusion of democracies, the illusion of Western democracies, France, England. There is a moment when the fact that they are deluding themselves becomes quite evident. Here is our story for tonight. In the end, I decided to start it on this day, November 19th, 1937. Less than 2 years remain until the outbreak of World War II. We know it, but they did not. On November 19, 1937, the English Foreign Minister, Lord Halifax, goes to Berlin, meets Hitler, and in Berlin, the English Minister, Lord Halifax, expresses sympathy for German claims. Because in England, there is now a generation that says yes. After all, we exaggerated at Versailles. We imposed unfair things on Germany. Ultimately, it is understandable that the Germans are asking for revisions. Halifax tells Hitler that England understands your claims regarding Poland, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. And over time, changes are also possible, says Lord Halifax in Berlin, as long as they are made peacefully and without causing upheaval. Lord Halifax also tells Hitler that Germany is the bulwark of Europe against Bolshevism. Because we must not forget, in order to understand how they reasoned during those years, that there is also this other thing. In Europe to the east, there is an elephant in the room that is pretended not to exist. It is spoken of as little as possible. The Soviet Union. There is the Soviet Union where in 1937, Stalin is already in power. We know that Stalin has put the world revolution on the back burner, but they do not know it. For them, the Soviet Union, for them, for Western politicians, the Soviet Union is still not just the country of communists, but of the dangerously revolutionary Bolsheviks. It is a country to be kept at a distance. Therefore, the Germany of Mr. Hitler, as the English diplomats refer to him, always calling him that, Mr. Hitler, is all in all, with its fierce anti-communism, with all those concentration camps where it has imprisoned German communists, is, after all, a useful country. And so it is in England, and so it is in France. In France, where unlike in England, there is a strong Communist Party, there is also a strong Socialist Party, and a left-wing government, the Popular Front. Today we have forgotten it, but at the time the Popular Front created, rather than Hollande, it created enormous illusions and enormous fears in France. And in France there is a ruling class, industrialist generals, the clergy, who in the face of a communist government, here, but better than Nazis, much better, better Hitler than Stalin is, the slogan of the French ruling classes at that moment. Thus, Hitler perceives that there is a climate in which certain things can be hoped for, certain things can be done. One just has to wait for the right opportunity. There has been much debate about whether Hitler had everything planned from the very beginning, with precise plans leading up to the invasion of Poland. You know, Woody Allen, when I hear Wagner, I don't know why I immediately feel like invading Poland. Well, the invasion of Poland is just the last act. There has been much discussion about it. Hitler had already decided everything from the beginning, or maybe not. In the 1960s, a famous book was published by an English historian, Alan Taylor, who said that after all, Hitler, as much of a criminal as he was, wanted normal things in foreign policy. Everyone wanted their country to be great and powerful, and Hitler wanted that too. He was waiting for good opportunities, sensing the air. The air was favorable, waiting for opportunities. And also to create the opportunities for it. Taylor did not know this as well, but the documents that have emerged later show that Hitler created the opportunities. It starts with Austria. Austria is a German-speaking country, and therefore there is a Nazi party in Austria that desires annexation to Germany and takes orders from Hitler. At a certain point, Hitler gives the green light to the Nazis in Austria to create agitation, attacks, terrorism, disorder, and political assassinations. Finally, at a certain moment, it is March 1938. 4 months have passed since Halifax's visit to Berlin, when he told Hitler, well, after all, one can understand your reasons. 4 months pass. In Vienna, the Austrian Nazi Party stages a coup and invites the German troops to enter Austria to ensure security. On March 12, 1938, German troops entered Austria, called the Anschluss, the annexation. It is said that the German army then was so unprepared for war that 70% of the military vehicles entering Austria broke down before reaching Vienna. But abroad, no one reacts. In Austria, there is popular enthusiasm, and a plebiscite is held that approves the annexation to Nazi Germany by 99%. The Cardinal of Vienna, Innitzer, declares that Austrian Catholics must thank the Lord and obey the new government, which has freed us from the communist threat, and abroad no one bats an eye. In England, the London Times writes, but in a way, it's a bit like what we did 2 centuries ago when Scotland joined England. These are quite normal things. The people wanted it. Hitler takes note. He has annexed Austria and no one has reacted. A few days pass, but really just a few days. Still in that March of 1938, Hitler summons the leader of the Czechoslovak Nazis, because there is also a Nazi party among the German minority in Czechoslovakia. They are called the Sudeten. I can never remember why, but the Germans in Czechoslovakia are called the Sudeten. Among the Germans in Czechoslovakia, there is a Nazi party that takes orders from Hitler. In March 1938, Hitler initiated, starting with street violence, agitation, and terrorism. Czechoslovakia begins to sink into chaos. The German press starts a very heavy campaign. The Germans in Czechoslovakia are oppressed. They are a discriminated, oppressed minority. The Czechoslovak police, criminal, arrest, violate, torture. The Germans in Czechoslovakia suffer. It cannot be endured. The English ambassadors in Berlin and Prague, under instructions from their government, say, well, after all, the Germans are not entirely wrong. One can understand. They repeat that the German claims are fundamentally justified, that the Czechoslovak government should try to meet the demands of the Germans a bit, as they do not want to unleash another war, right? Therefore, the Czechoslovak government would do better to make concessions. There is only one country. At that moment, when the Nazis in Czechoslovakia begin the same game they played in Austria, there is only one country that, at that moment, takes a public stance and says that all powers should come to an agreement to guarantee Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union. And of course, no one is listening to it, because Czechoslovakia is the country. The Soviet Union is the Bolshevik, communist country, and out of the game. The English ambassador in Moscow, in those weeks, he sends a report to London in which he concludes that Russia, I quote, should be considered outside of European politics. We can pretend that Russia does not exist. They still note the difficulty of acknowledging how the world is changing. They continue to talk about European politics as if it were still always England, France, and well, the United States is not there, Japan, the Union, nothing. It is still always European politics, and Russia does not count. Months go by with Czechoslovakia in chaos, and the German press hammering away at the suffering of the Sudeten people. It is England and France who are pressing the Prague government, saying, make some concessions. September comes. The situation is so dire. The English government and the French government decide the Czechoslovaks need to make concessions to Hitler. We need to come up with something. We should come up with a conference. Today we would call it a negotiation table. But back then they hadn't invented the table or the summit yet. They say we should hold a conference. How do we convince Hitler to accept a negotiation table? Let's ask Mussolini. After all, they are friends. The English and the French turn to Mussolini and essentially say, to summarize, listen, if Hitler is willing to arrange for all of us to meet and agree to accommodate the German requests regarding Czechoslovakia. Hitler agrees. On September 29th to 30th, 1938, there is that page which has always been lamented as, how shall I put it, one of the low points of European politics, even if at least 2 of the 4 protagonists were acting in good faith at the Munich conference. In Munich, Hitler, Mussolini, the English Prime Minister Chamberlain, and the French Prime Minister Daladier meet. At least Chamberlain and Daladier are acting in good faith. It is hard to have doubts about this. They have a nightmare. Like the entire generation that witnessed the First World War. Like the entire generation that witnessed the slaughter of the First World War, the politicians of those years have one thing in mind when there is a crisis. Everything but a new war. Never again a war, no cost, or if you indeed prefer, peace at any cost. What is the cost of anything? Well, if Czechoslovakia has to cede a piece of territory to Germany, so be it. Better this way. The Munich conference involves England, France, Italy, and Germany meeting to decide which part of Czechoslovakia will be ceded to Germany. The Czechoslovaks are waiting outside the door to find out what is decided. And the Munich conference decides the area populated by Germans, the Sudetenland, is ceded to Germany. Hitler takes note. Not only did they not hinder me, they even helped me take a piece of Czechoslovakia. And here, how can I put it? I just said it. I don't know. It's difficult to talk about because on one hand, one might say, as has been said for 50 years, what a tragedy of politicians at that level. But those were politicians, so to speak, of the highest level, who did not understand what was happening and were acting in good faith. Chamberlain returns to London, and he has been mocked for this return from Munich up to today. Chamberlain returns to London just as he descends the steps of the airplane. He waves the sheet with the agreements. You see, there are photographers, the crowd all around. Chamberlain waves the sheet and speaks to the crowd. I will translate it directly for you. Chamberlain's speech to the crowd that first day, stepping off the plane from Munich. The resolution of the Czechoslovak problem, which we have now reached, is, in my opinion, only the beginning of a broader settlement in which all of Europe can find peace. We are 11 months before the outbreak of the Second World War. Let's remember that. Chamberlain says, this morning I had another meeting with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler, and here is the treaty that bears his signature and mine. We consider the treaty signed last night as a symbol of the desire of our two peoples to never go to war against each other again. My dear friends, the British Prime Minister has returned from Germany, bringing peace with honor. I believe this is peace for our time. Go home and have a nice, peaceful sleep. This is Chamberlain's speech to the crowd in London returning from Munich. Chamberlain's policy has a specific name that later became a bad word in the jargon of English politics, which we will revisit tomorrow evening when discussing Mrs. Thatcher. Appeasement, pacification, peace at any cost. And appeasement today is indeed shocking. They didn't realize, The tragic irony of this is that they were willing to do anything to avoid war. As a result, they caused it to break out. Well understood. Hitler was skilled. Hitler was very good at leading people on, at deceiving his interlocutors. In Munich, Hitler tells Chamberlain, "Listen to this," referring to Chamberlain again, saying, "I spoke with Hitler." Speaking with great sincerity, Hitler told me that this was the last of his territorial ambitions in Europe. And he said it. Hitler, he was so sincere, so sleep soundly. But Chamberlain is not the only one. Chamberlain and Daladier are not the only ones being deceived, apart from Mussolini, who also believes it. Even Poland believes it. Poland, let us remember, will be the victim when the war breaks out. Poland, when the partition of Czechoslovakia, decided at Munich, takes place, takes advantage of it and also grabs a piece of Czechoslovakia. Poland is a militaristic country, governed by colonels, a half-democracy, authoritarian, fiercely nationalist, and extremely anti-communist. At that moment, the Poles are convinced that they can befriend Hitler, as we are all anti-communists. Who is more anti-communist than Hitler? We Poles even more so. Therefore, the Poles in those months, late 38, early 39, believe they are friends with Hitler. And Hitler, on January 30th, 1939, 7 months before the outbreak of the World War, says that the friendship between Germany and Poland is one of the reassuring factors in the political life of Europe at the Reichstag, the German parliament. The Polish foreign minister Beck goes to Berlin at the end of January 1939, the year of meetings with Hitler, during which Beck does not hide that Poland would certainly like to expand towards the Soviet Union and take a piece of Ukraine. There are Polish minorities there, and in the future, it could also be discussed. Meanwhile, while these nice speeches are being made, January, February, March of 39, Czechoslovakia is falling apart. It has lost the entire area inhabited by Germans. It has lost most of its industries. It has lost its border fortifications. At this point, Slovakia wants to become independent. It's an old story, you know it, then it happened. Currently, it is independent, it's separated. Czechoslovakia is sinking. It is about to be invaded by Hungary. At a certain point, Hitler decides to resolve the problem. On March 14, 1939, Hitler orders the Czechoslovak president, Aka, to come and speak with him in Berlin. The Czechoslovak president complies. He arrives in Berlin, and at dawn on March 15th, Hitler informs him that the German army is about to enter Czechoslovakia to maintain order, and that the Czechoslovak president must sign a document stating that he requested it. Otherwise, Prague will be razed to the ground by the Luftwaffe. President Acha first suffers a heart attack and then, with the doctors keeping him awake, signs the request for German intervention. On March 15th, the Germans invade Czechoslovakia. No one intervenes in the world. Hitler takes note. Once again, no one has intervened. But you will say it was about time. Chamberlain begins to think that perhaps one cannot trust Hitler after all. 2 days later, Chamberlain speaks to the House of Commons, March 17th, 1939. I translate Chamberlain's speech in which he evidently says things he really does not want to say. You can feel it, it's a syntax. Chamberlain says, "But as is often the case, this question inevitably and unavoidably comes to mind and lingers. But if it is so easy to find good reasons to ignore guarantees given so solemnly and so repeatedly, then what trust can we place in other guarantees that will come from the same source? Is this the last attack against a small state, or will it be followed by others? Isn't this a step towards an attempt to in any way completely dominate the world by force?" Chamberlain is clearly hoping that they will say no, don't worry, no. But the doubt begins to arise. The counterproof arrives immediately. The Germans invaded Czechoslovakia on March 15th. 10 days later, on March 26th, Hitler presents the Polish government with a request to annex the free city of Danzig. The Poles refuse. Hitler speaks at the Reichstag late April 1939. 3 months earlier, in the same place, Hitler stated that the friendship between Germany and Poland is one of the reassuring foundations of European policy. 3 months later, the issue of Danzig is perhaps the most painful problem for Germany. I thought that its peaceful resolution would help to definitively ease the tension in Europe. The Polish government rejected my offer. I am indeed very sorry about this incomprehensible attitude of the Polish government. From that moment on, conflicts, incidents, and shootings begin at the border between Danzig and Poland. Nazi militias are forming in Danzig. Outside there is the Polish customs, with incidents occurring every day. But this time the English government and the French government are starting to think that perhaps it is time to do something. What? England and France proposed to the Poles to negotiate a treaty of alliance. In fact, Chamberlain goes so far as to officially guarantee that even though the treaty has not yet been signed, if Poland were attacked by someone, who knows who, but if it were attacked by someone, England and France are ready to defend her. Poland. Oh, keep in mind, today in hindsight, one might say it was about time. What else can you do? But at the time, it is very difficult to make this acceptable to public opinion. At that time, public opinion in England and France says Danzig, well, we should go to war for Danzig. The newspapers are full of headlines, but dying for Danzig, no. However, the French government and the English government, undaunted, having discovered that perhaps Hitler cannot be trusted, do something unprecedented in April-May 1939. They begin to see if some form of agreement can be made with the Soviet Union. And they begin a negotiation that will last many months, to see if a military defense agreement can be made in case there is a war. The story of this negotiation is a sad and depressing one, because one might say, well, if only they had made this agreement. But it seems that no one really wants to do it. Everyone is afraid of the other men's reactions. What is evident is a fact that seems objective, because it is based on the telegrams that are sent and the responses. Every time England and France make a proposal to the Russians respond the next day. Then weeks go by, weeks. Finally, the English and the French take the next step. The Russians respond the next day. And it goes on like this, with this negotiation dragging on. But in the meantime, Stalin takes note. They are asking me to negotiate. But do they believe me? Or do they want to pull me in and then, at the right moment, leave me to deal with Germany? Stalin takes note and decides that risks cannot be taken. He is negotiating a military agreement with England and France, but the English and French seem very lukewarm. Stalin informs the Germans that even though their countries are enemies, one is communist, the other is, they have commercial interests. Perhaps opening negotiations for a trade agreement between Germany and the Soviet Union could also be a good idea. The Germans are on board. And so begins this situation that lasts throughout the summer. Stalin, without anyone knowing, is simultaneously negotiating with England and France at one table and with Germany at another, waiting to see what happens. And Italy is very friendly with Nazi Germany. On May 22nd, 1939, they signed the Pact of Steel amid the enthusiasm of the press. Unfailing friendship between our two peoples. But in reality, Mussolini is worried. He is worried because the Nazis have assured him that they do not want to go to war for the moment. But he is starting to not be so sure anymore. And the first thing we need to have very clear, although it is not always stated so clearly, even though it is well known and documented, is why Mussolini is not so sure. Because Italy at that moment is completely devoid of resources. Italy fought the war in Ethiopia and the war in Spain. The intervention in Spain alongside Franco went well, and the war in Ethiopia was a triumph. The war in Spain also went fairly well, but wars cost. terrifying amounts. The wars in Ethiopia and Spain mean that there is a gaping hole in the Italian budget. There is no money left for anything, especially not for modern weapons. Now, it so happens that in recent years, since everyone has understood the prevailing atmosphere, all countries are experimenting with new weapons. In all countries, they are putting into production new concept fighters, the Spitfire, and new tanks. The armaments that were adequate 2 or 3 years ago are aging rapidly. The only country that does not have the money to do it is Italy. Mussolini knows this, even though he sometimes prefers to forget it. But he knows that at that moment, in the summer of '39, he has a concern that the Germans might think of going to war. At the beginning of August, Ciano writes in his diary, "You know Galeazzo Ciano, the foreign minister, son-in-law of Mussolini, who will be executed 5 years later, after the Verona trial. But that is another story." At the beginning of August, Ciano, our foreign minister, notes in his diary that it is time to see how things stand. The game is too big, so Ciano flies to Germany. On August 11th, he meets with his colleague, the German foreign minister von Ribbentrop. Ciano is sent by Ribbentrop with the task of explaining to him that going to war at that moment would be madness. It must absolutely not be done. Ciano asks Ribbentrop, "But all this story you are raising about Poland, what is it that you want? Do you want Danzig?" Ribbentrop replies, "No longer, we want war." I am at a reception. Everyone is there with champagne glasses in hand. Ciano is eager to tell his collaborators what Ribbentrop has just told him, but they are at a reception. Ciano later writes all these things in his diary. He finally passes by one of his collaborators, Ciano, and whispers in his ear, "We're in for a fight." Afterward, Ciano speaks again with Ribbentrop. And Ribbentrop tells him, "Yes, we will go to war with Poland. It is now decided we will crush Poland." And he says, "But what about England, France?" And Ribbentrop tells him, "You'll see, they won't intervene." And the bet, as in 1914, for those of you who were there last night, is that the bet will not intervene, except that this time you know that history repeats itself. First tragedy, and then farce. This time they really make the bet, in the sense that Ribbentrop says to Ciano, let's bet that they won't intervene. If I win, you have to give me a nice Italian Renaissance painting. If you win, I'll give you a collection of ancient German weapons, but you'll see, I will win, they won't intervene. We will go to war, and it will not become a world war, because France and England will not dare to intervene. The gala dinner ends, the reception ends, the toasts, everything. Ciano returns to the hotel with his other collaborators. He is burning with the desire to tell them everything. They are at the hotel. He begins to doubt that perhaps the Germans have placed microphones in the room, so they closed themselves in the bathroom, and locked in the bathroom, Ciano tells his collaborators that the Germans have now decided to go to war. And here the countdown begins. August 12th, the day after Ciano's interview with Ribbentrop. Saturday, August 12th. Oh, it's Ferragosto. This war, like the first one, breaks out in the middle of summer. At that time, there are not many holidays yet, but there are some. Around Ferragosto, people go away. On Saturday, August 12th, for example, Milan empties out. 500,000 people take the train to go to the sea. On the same day, the Franco-English delegation arrives in Moscow. Finally, after months of discussions, they send a delegation to Moscow to negotiate a treaty. The Soviets are very disappointed. The delegation consists of a French general and an English admiral, who are second-rate figures. The Russians ask him, "But do you have full powers to sign a treaty?" This thing stops me for a second. This issue of full powers is crucial for understanding the diplomatic exchanges of this era, where, of course, there is the telephone, the telegraph, and the airplane. But having someone on site who can sign is something that everyone considers fundamental. The Soviets ask, "Have you come to negotiate?" Very well. There is urgency. Do you have full powers? And the French general and the English admiral respond, "No, you tell us and we report." The Soviets remain very disappointed. On the same day, the Soviet government sends an invitation to Berlin. It would be good for Ribbentrop to come to Moscow, because we have things to discuss. Sunday, August 13th, full summer, holidays, the Venice Film Festival. Maria Bellonci wins the Viareggio Prize with Lucrezia Borgia. On the same day, Hitler calls Mussolini. It's just as Ciano told you. We will go to war with Poland. At the first incident, we will attack. Not only that, Hitler explains, we are in mid-August. My generals have calculated that to defeat Poland, it will take a month and a half, 6 weeks at most. Now, by mid-October, autumn arrives, and in Poland, the roads and airports become unusable due to mud. Therefore, we need to finish by mid-October. We need a month and a half, so we will attack by the end of August. Mussolini and the others in Italy are astonished. Ciano notes in his diary, they have deceived and lied to us. On Monday, August 14th, in a vacation atmosphere, there is the Salzburg Festival. Hitler, who is in the mountains, goes to the Salzburg Festival, the abduction from the harem by Mozart. In Moscow, the Russians meet with the Anglo-French delegation and lay their cards on the table. Do we want to make an agreement to defend Poland? That's fine, but we want the guarantee that it is serious, that the Poles will allow Russian troops to enter Polish territory if there is war. They are acting in good faith, they are acting in bad faith, they are already thinking of devouring Poland, or do they seriously think that if a war must be fought, it must be fought seriously? It's unclear. In the meantime, they say this. What do the English admiral and the French general respond? It is not our responsibility. We must report. We will report to Paris and London. We will see. On that same Monday, August 14th, Ribbentrop decides that the idea from the Russians for him to go to Moscow is a good idea. He will go. Tuesday, August 15th, Ferragosto. The French general has written to Paris that the Russians want a guarantee that the Poles will allow them to enter in case of war in order to sign the agreement. It is necessary to ask the Poles. The French Foreign Minister Bonnet is seeking the Polish ambassador. Where do you think the Polish ambassador is on Ferragosto? At the sea. And from the sea, they make him return to Paris. They tell him to grant passage to the Russians in case of war against Germany. The ambassador says, I have to ask Warsaw, but in my opinion, they will say no. Because we are even more afraid of the Russians than of the Germans. French Minister Bonnet warns the Polish ambassador, look, we have information that Hitler has declared he will liquidate Poland in 3 weeks. The Polish ambassador responds. This is important for understanding the climate there and what the Polish regime was like. The Polish ambassador responds that it will be Poland that invades Germany from the very first days. On Wednesday, August 16th, Ribbentrop writes to Moscow, I am coming. It is the first time they put in writing that he will make this trip to sign a treaty with the Soviets. In Berlin, the Germans begin to worry about one thing. Those of you who were there last night will forgive me. History sometimes repeats itself. The Germans are asking themselves, and what will England do? Therefore, at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they summon the English ambassador and say to him, but it's not that you support Poland, is it? Do you see how crazy these Poles are? The provocations? The German minority in Poland is oppressed? It's all the fault of the Poles who are not reasonable people? But you English wouldn't be willing to help a bunch of crazies, would you? The English ambassador responds that if the Germans have this idea, they are greatly mistaken, that they have understood nothing of the English mentality, and that there is no doubt that if Poland is attacked, England will help her. Thursday, August 17th. Incidents, shootings, and border violations are multiplying along the border between Germany and Poland. The German press launches a campaign. Remember Czechoslovakia from the year before. The German press launches a campaign. Polish terror against the German minority. Arrests, murders. The response from Ribbentrop arrives in Moscow. I am willing to come to sign an agreement. Friday, August 18th. As you know, Mussolini and Ciano are terrified because Italy is not ready to go to war. But the official line that is dictated to the Italian press is obviously quite different. We have made the Pact of Steel. The Italian press has precise orders. In this crisis, the Germans are right. Therefore, I will read you some headlines from the Corriere della Sera of August 18th. The tragic responsibilities of democracies, of course, democracy is indeed a dirty word in fascist Italy, which have unleashed and supported Polish arrogance, the unwavering firmness of the Axis against the warmongering cloaked in hypocrisy of the encirclers, where the encirclers are precisely the Demo-Pluto-Judocracies. France, England, and the Soviet Union besieging the peoples. In short, we know this story in Italy. On that same Friday, August 18th, the Polish government must decide whether to form an alliance with the Soviet Union while allowing the passage of Soviet troops. The Polish government says no. We have no military agreements with the Soviet Union and do not wish to have any. Here there is also a famous comment that has since become proverbial from a Polish general who declares, "With the Germans, we risk losing our freedom. With the Russians, we lose our soul." Therefore, no agreement. On Saturday, August 19th, news arrives in Moscow that the Poles do not want an agreement with Russia. Therefore, the negotiation stalls. The Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov. He writes to Berlin saying, at this point, let Ribbentrop come. Do we want to meet on the 26th or the 27th? On Sunday, August 20th, a telegram from Hitler to Stalin. Note that this is the first time in history that a Western head of government personally writes to the head of the Soviet government. Until that moment, the Soviet Union was like a country of lepers. They spoke only indirectly and under the table. The first telegram from a Western leader to Stalin is from Hitler, who on August 20th tells him, I am glad you have agreed to meet Ribbentrop, but why on the 26th, 27? Let's do it sooner. Let's do it on the 22 or the Monday, August 21st. Mussolini and Ciano racked their brains to find a way to avoid war. He thinks of doing like last year, a nice conference in Munich, an international conference where everyone comes to an agreement. Therefore, they call Berlin to speak with Foreign Minister Ribbentrop and propose this nice idea from Ciano's diary. Ribbentrop is unavailable. Finally, in the afternoon, Ribbentrop responds and says, I cannot discuss these matters right now. I am waiting for an important message from Moscow. On that day, in fact, on August 21st, Stalin receives Hitler's telegram at 3 p.m. and responds at 5 p.m. Of course, we can do it sooner. Ribbentrop can come to Moscow the day after tomorrow on the 23rd, and we will sign a non-aggression pact between Germany and the Soviet Union. Oh, let's stop on this matter. It's a crucial decision, one of those that strongly contributed to what happened. It is an absolutely unexpected and shocking decision. On this, we must be very clear because, well, I'll share my opinion. Some may disagree, but for many years we have been brainwashed into believing that all totalitarianisms are the same, that Stalin's Soviet Union and Hitler's Germany were the same thing. And so their agreement also seems less strange. The reality is that for the people of that time, it is an immense shock because Nazi Germany and the Communist Soviet Union, they appear to be the two most opposed and enemy countries that exist, and they are. It is a testament to the extraordinary cynicism, cunning, and coldness of both the Nazis and Stalin and his group that they make this agreement, which leaves the world astonished. Stalin has decided that the English and French are too soft. They don't want the agreement, so I will make it with the Nazis in spite of them because I need to be sure. I will add a small thing. This is something that few know, perhaps many of you do not know it, a little piece of the context of those days. When Stalin decides that since things are going very badly, as Ciano says, we are at a breaking point, Stalin determines that he absolutely needs security, even at the cost of making a pact with the devil, knowing that we won't keep the pact later, but for the moment it is necessary. What is the small piece of context that at the time no one knew and even today few remember? In those same days, the Soviet Union is fighting a secret and undeclared war with Japan in Mongolia. In Mongolia, which is a communist republic allied with the Soviets and borders the Chinese Manchukuo occupied by the Japanese, a full-scale war involving entire army corps is underway in the summer of '39. A war that will ultimately result in 70,000 dead and wounded, but which the two governments agree not to reveal to the world. And the world hears nothing about it, let alone the borders between Mongolia and Manchuria. It is a full-scale war because the Japanese are crossing into Mongolia from China. The Mongolians ask the Soviets for help. The Soviets come, and then in parentheses, the Soviets win the war decisively, led by a general who will later become famous, Zhukov, who will also reach Berlin in 6 years. Zhukov defeats the Japanese, and this is happening during those days. Zhukov's attack begins on August 20th. On the 21st, with the battle ongoing, Stalin decides to make the pact with Germany. Because anyway, we need to guarantee at least one border. That very day, the news is made public. Mussolini and Ciano are shocked, like the whole world, by the agreement between Germany and the Soviet Union. They are shocked but also admiring. These Germans are strong. Ciano's diary. There is no doubt that the Germans have made a masterstroke. The European situation is in turmoil. Then Ciano makes a shrewd observation. England, and even more so France, is full of communists. How will they deal with all the communists they have at home to wage war against Germany, which is suddenly a friend of the Soviet Union? And then there is indeed Ciano's conclusion, which I quote because it is emblematic of the language and moral level of the regime. Ciano concludes in his diary, "It is advisable to wait and, if possible, to be ready to also likely take our share of the spoils." On Tuesday, August 22nd, Hitler summons the generals and gives the final orders for the war. He says, "The moment is right. It's like in 14, remember? The right moment, we have to do it now." But the interesting thing is that Hitler does not refer to the preparation of the armies. No. Hitler has something else in mind. This is a famous speech by Hitler to his generals on August 22nd. Hitler says that we must go to war as soon as possible while I am still here, because there will never be another leader in Germany with my power, my following. But I can unfortunately be taken out at any given time by a traitor or potentially an idiot. Isn't it Hitler's political culture? It's all tied to political terrorism, to political murder. It's normal. It can happen. So as long as they haven't killed me yet, let's go ahead with this war. And then the other thing that Hitler says is also, as long as Mussolini is there, because as long as Mussolini is there, we can trust Italy. He is the only man with a steady nerve in Italy. When he is no longer there, he is deluding himself, still trusting, because Mussolini at that precise moment has already decided to withdraw, but Hitler is still deluding himself about his old friend. On Wednesday, August 23rd, the agreement between Germany and the Soviet Union is announced in the world press. Evening Courier, the German-Soviet agreement, the grand political success of the Axis, has shattered the murky maneuver of the democratic encirclers. Astonishment and bewilderment in the anti-totalitarian countries. Anti-totalitarian is obviously a bad word. We are totalitarian. It was invented by Mussolini, the concept of being a totalitarian country. Those other softies, the French, they are anti-totalitarian. Poland is still the Evening Courier of August 23rd. Poland will have to seek its salvation by negotiating quickly with Germany. Poland is beginning to give in, to think that perhaps an agreement with the Soviet Union, even with the devil, could be made, but it is too late. On that August 23rd, Ribbentrop flew to Moscow and signed the Non-Aggression Pact, which was made public, and also signed the secret protocol, which was not made public, in which Germany and the Soviet Union agreed to divide Poland. Hitler receives the English ambassador that day because his only remaining concern is to keep England out of it anyway. Hitler receives the English ambassador and tells him about the horrors that the Poles are committing against the German minority in Poland. Here is a small detail that I could have suppressed like many others, but even tonight I didn't have the courage to suppress too many details. I will have to keep it brief because I'm wasting too much time. But anyway, Hitler, this is a morbid conversation of Hitler with the English ambassador about the horrors that the Poles are committing against the Germans. Hitler tells him, "Indeed, I also have many cases where Germans have been castrated by the Poles." The English ambassador in his report to London says that by pure chance I was aware of one of these cases, of a case. The era. The German in question was a sexual maniac who was treated as he deserved. Mr. Hitler replied to me that he knew of 6 cases, not just one, and they continue like this. Mr. Hitler also tells him that this matter with Poland is the last one. I am an artist, not a warrior. If I settle this matter with Poland, I will withdraw from politics and dedicate myself to art. The ambassador reports to London. Friday, August 25th, Mr. Hitler orders the attack for tomorrow. Then he receives a letter from Mussolini, in which Mussolini for the first time tells him the truth. Italy is not ready to go to war. However, he does not have the courage to tell him everything. So Mussolini says to Mr. Hitler, "Look, as things stand now, we could not go to war. We would need large supplies of raw materials." If Germany can ensure Mr. Hitler is disappointed, but he goes along with it, he decides to postpone the attack on Poland by a few days. In the meantime, he asks Mussolini, "But exactly what supplies of raw materials do you need?" Saturday, August 26th. Mussolini and the heads of the Italian armed forces meet at the Venezia Palace to draft the list of raw materials to request from Germany. The generals have been fed information by Ciano. In making this list, there is no criminal optimism. I mean, you understand? Go in hard. They make the list, I'll read it to you. 6 million tons of coal. To put it in perspective, this is the Italian production for 2 years. 2 million tons of steel, the Italian production for 1 year. 7 million tons of mineral oils, 1 million tons of timber. And then copper, sodium nitrate, potassium salts, rubber, toluene, turpentine, lead, tin, nickel, molybdenum, tungsten, titanium, 20 tons of zirconium. The list has gone down in history as the molybdenum list. They send it to the Italian ambassador in Berlin, Attolico. Ambassador Attolico takes it to Ribbentrop. Ribbentrop looks at the list and asks, "But by when do you need all this stuff?" It's a drama because they didn't tell Attolico anything. He has no instructions, but he understands the situation, so he improvises immediately. It was calculated that it would take 17,000 trains to send all that stuff to Italy. Ribbentrop goes to Mr. Hitler and they understand. They finally get it. Italy is not on board. It will stay out, and that's fine. Patience. Mr. Hitler writes to Mussolini and tells him that it's fine. Even if Italy cannot enter the war, they will manage on their own. It is enough for Italy not to let it be known that it will stay out. If you don't flaunt it too much, it already helps us. And then Mr. Hitler says another thing, a small thing but indicative of the future. He says you could help us by sending Italian workers to Germany. And in this way, quietly begins what will later be a long story, right? And it really shows how things change. The Germans have opened their eyes to the fact that they cannot count on military help from Italy. Instead, they can count on the workers. This is where the whole story begins about the millions of Italians who will first be convinced and then forced to go work in Germany. On Sunday, August 27th, rationing is introduced in Germany, along with a food ration card. On Monday, August 28th, England and France still think that perhaps they could convince the Poles to negotiate and insist with the Polish government. Go and ask the Germans exactly what they want, and let's see about discussing it. Tuesday, August 29th. In Italy, a ban on the circulation of private cars is implemented, and austerity measures are introduced in restaurants, where only one dish can be offered on the menu, either meat or fish, but only one. The English ambassador goes to Hitler to see if it is still possible to negotiate at the last moment. The English ambassador writes to London, "Hitler was not pleasant this evening. It was an interview, a stormy conversation. He kept saying that he desires English friendship more than anything else in the world, but he cannot sacrifice the vital interests of Germany. However, Hitler said However, if you guarantee me that the Poles are truly willing to negotiate, that's fine. They can send me an emissary from Berlin tomorrow with full powers, and we can still negotiate. On Wednesday, August 30th, the World Cycling Championships in Varese are suspended in Italy, and a ban on the sale of coffee to the public is issued, including in bars, with a prohibition on drinking coffee cups. All coffee is reserved for the armed forces. In France, train services are suspended. They evacuate the zoo of Vincennes to save the animals. In all the capitals, they begin to construct air raid shelters and distribute gas masks to the population, as they were certain that the war would start with tremendous aerial bombardments on the cities using choking gas. That day, Wednesday, August 30th, the English Foreign Minister, Lord Halifax, the same one who 2 years earlier told Hitler, "Well, your claims are understandable after all." On that day, August 30th, Lord Halifax writes to the English ambassador in Berlin. He says the Germans want a Polish plenipotentiary in Berlin today. But that is unreasonable. They must understand that too. The English ambassador replies to him, "I made the same observation to Herr Hitler last night." He replied that one can fly from Warsaw to Berlin in an hour and a half. At this point, the English, desperate to avoid war, begin to put heavy pressure on the Polish government. "You must not provoke the Germans. Enough with these Polish newspapers that write articles against Germany. Enough with the anti-German campaign. Send a plenipotentiary to Berlin immediately to discuss." The English ambassador returns to Ribbentrop and tells him, "We are doing everything possible. We are trying to advise the Polish government to make peace, to reach an agreement." Ribbentrop responds to the English ambassador, saying that the advice from the English has had damned little effect so far. The English ambassador replies to him and reports back to London. I replied that I was astonished to hear such language from a foreign minister. At this point, there is a new play, though somewhat a dark comedy in the German style. Ribbentrop tells him, "Yes, we had prepared the conditions for an agreement with Poland. These are they." And the English ambassador reports to London saying, "At this point, Ribbentrop has started to read me this very long document in German very quickly. I, since I thought he would give it to me afterwards, didn't pay much attention. When he finished, I asked him about the conditions for Poland to make the agreement. Ribbentrop told me, no, it's too late. The Polish plenipotentiary was supposed to arrive yesterday." The English ambassador says to him, "But couldn't you hand it over to the Polish ambassador in Berlin?" Ribbentrop replies, "Never. We will never summon him." The English ambassador then asks, "But what if he requests to be summoned?" Ribbentrop says, "Well, in that case, we could also see..." The English ambassador continues to not... continue. Maybe he realized that they are pulling his leg because he writes to London that evening. What are we? By August 30th, it's almost over, isn't it? The English ambassador in Berlin writes to London that evening saying this conversation with Ribbentrop was extremely unpleasant. Throughout the entire evening, Ribbentrop mimicked Hitler at his worst. August 31st. The English tell the Poles to send a plenipotentiary to Berlin, or at least to send their ambassador to knock and ask for the conditions for negotiation. The Poles respond that they will not send the ambassador, as it would be too humiliating. At 12:40 p.m. on that August 31st, Hitler signs the order for the attack for the following morning. At 1 in the afternoon, the Poles reconsider. Without telling the English, they order the Polish ambassador in Berlin, Lipski, to go to Ribbentrop and ask what the conditions for negotiation are. Lipski goes to Ribbentrop. They ask him, "But does she have full powers?" "No, I don't have them." Then we have nothing to say to each other. And they send him away. That evening, there is the famous Gleiwitz incident. The Gleiwitz incident is a curious thing. It is curious especially for this reason. After all that I have indeed told you, a person today would certainly not believe that the Germans needed a pretext to declare war on Poland. Instead, they want a pretext, and the German secret services under Heydrich's command have already prepared the pretext. Heydrich, Reinhard Heydrich, a big shot in the SS, head of the security services, who will later be killed, executed 4 years later by Czechoslovak partisans in Prague. Heydrich has prepared a commando. For 2 weeks at Gleiwitz, a German radio station near the Polish border, I am waiting for 12 men from the German secret services, dressed in Polish uniforms and carrying Polish documents. They are ready to spring into action as soon as the right moment arrives. The morning of August 31st is the right moment. Heydrich sends the password to the commando. The grandmother has died. The commando goes into action in Polish uniforms in German territory, attacking the Gleiwitz radio station. They shoot, seize the radio, and broadcast a rambling communique, as was said in our times during the BR in Polish. And then they leave behind a dead man in Polish uniform. Therefore, there was a Polish aggression in German territory. The Germans have the right to invade Poland and begin a few hours later at dawn on September 1st. But in the meantime, during the night, Lord Halifax, the English foreign minister, who still hopes that the Germans are sincere and that a negotiation with the Poles can really be opened, is worried because these stupid Poles do not want to send the ambassador. He does not know that the Polish ambassador had already gone the day before and was thrown out. On the night of September 1st, Lord Halifax sends perhaps the most pointless telegram that the British government has ever sent to his ambassador in Berlin and Warsaw. It says, "But I don't see why the Polish government doesn't want to. Its ambassador is making difficulties. The Polish ambassador should accept this document from the German government. A refusal on their part would be seriously misunderstood by public opinion. Her Majesty's government is ready to do everything to assist in mediation." And to the ambassador in Warsaw, he says, "Go tell the Polish government that their ambassador must go to Ribbentrop immediately to save the peace." That evening, the English ambassador in Warsaw responds to Lord Halifax. "Your telegram was deciphered at 4 this morning." Mr. Lipski, the Polish ambassador in Berlin, had already met with the German foreign minister at 6:30 yesterday in light of this fact, which was followed by the German invasion of Poland this morning at dawn. It is clearly pointless for me to carry out your instructions. It will be another 2 days before England and France decide to declare war on Germany in the hope, I was about to say the desperate hope, and the fatigue cannot be said, but in short, in the foolish and naive hope and in good faith that this catastrophe can still be avoided. Meanwhile, in Italy, Mussolini is calm. Hitler has accepted that we are staying out, so we are waiting, as Ciano says, to see if we can also do our part of the bottle. Naturally, however, the Italian press does not say this. The Italian press must say something else. So I conclude with the Corriere della Sera from September 1st. Hitler's proposals for Danzig were reasonable and entirely feasible, foolishly dismissed by Warsaw and London. England and its allies are pinned to their terrible responsibilities, while the conscious wisdom and moderation of Germany stand in stark contrast to the blind intransigence of the other parties in conflict. And these are the newspapers that our fathers read in this happy country of ours in 1939. Thank you. Good evening. So how do wars break out? Third episode, the Falkland War. These days, more than one person has asked me, but why the Falkland War after the 2 world wars? Why? Naturally, because even though Pope Francis rightly alerts us, the Third World War has not yet broken out, so we cannot tell it yet. The Falkland War is the only war between 2 major Western countries, capitalist, allies of the United States. It is the only war between 2 major Western countries that has been fought from 1945 to today. And it doesn't seem like a small thing to me, all things considered. It is also the only war between 2 major Western countries that I remember in my lifetime. And at the time, it had quite an impression on me and fascinated me, which is probably why I decided to tell its story. And then there is another reason, the Falkland War. But I'm speaking as if we all remember it. Many of us do remember the War of England against Argentina in 1982. Here, 32 years have passed. And now English law states that after 30 years, the documents are made public. They are, as they say, horrifically now declassified. In other words, the important thing is that there are the documents. Then one might know those really secret and somewhat ugly ones are probably made to disappear anyway. But in fact, 2 years ago, the English government made a ton of confidential or secret documents available. Anyway, it says top secret on them. And now they are all online, they can all be found. There is a fantastic site, You Need to Understand English, from the Margaret Thatcher Foundation, where you can find this huge amount of documents, the transcripts of the phone calls with Reagan, the notes, the comments on the telegram, the minutes of the cabinet meetings, and so on. An endless array of things that one would want to have, including the minutes of the ministerial meetings. Confidentially, I'm not talking about Obama or Putin, maybe even about Renzi today, all things considered, knowing what they say to each other when they are really in private. Perhaps in 30 years we will know. In any case, we know what they were saying in '82. And this is perhaps the main reason why I felt the urge to go see how that war broke out, which I call the Falkland War because we have to choose anyway. It's a bit sad because deciding to refer to them as the Falkland War already means taking a side. You know, the English called them the Falkland Islands, the Argentinians called them the Malvinas, and deciding to call them in a certain way already means taking a position. Well, they were officially called the Falkland at the time, and they are called the Falkland today. But I don't deny it. I do not deny that, in my opinion, well, let's say I find that the English were not entirely wrong regarding that war, all things considered, so I don't mind calling it the Falkland Islands War. So, to understand, to try to understand, to tell how that war broke out, the main thing is to know what the Falkland Islands are, which is indeed more than what the majority of the English were aware of at that time, if those English journalists are in fact correct. The vast majority of the British people thought that the Falkland Islands were islands somewhere off the coast of Scotland. In fact, the Falkland Islands are a fairly large archipelago. Together, they are about half the size of Sicily. They are an archipelago, lost in the South Atlantic, far to the south towards the Antarctic, and the closest place is Argentina. The Falkland Islands are 500 kilometers from the Argentine coast and are inhabited by a population of English and Scottish origin who speak English and hold British citizenship. And this state of affairs lasted, now don't make me do the math, but at the time I'm talking about it was exactly 150 years. In the year of 1833, Her Majesty's British fleet took possession of the Falkland Islands. So in 1983, the significant anniversary celebration was expected. It was a notable event. You know that the 150th anniversaries are serious matters, which then lead to discussions, make people think, and so on. So, in Argentina, not so much in England, you will excuse me, I will often say England instead of Great Britain. It is our Italian habit. Not so much in England, where people thought they were little Scottish islands like Orkney and Shetland, but in Argentina. The approach of this anniversary, 150 years of English occupation of the Malvinas, made people in Argentina think and discuss. Because the other thing to know in order to understand what I will tell you tonight is that in Argentina, the Malvinas are a popular myth. In Argentina, school children have been taught for a period of 150 years that the bad imperialist English colonizers have occupied the Malvinas, and one day they will have to give them back. Because the Falkland Islands are Argentine, the Malvinas are Argentine. Everyone in Argentina knows about this. They have all heard it since they were children. It's like Trento and Trieste in Italy during the First World War. Perhaps if you want, with this small difference that in Trento and Trieste the inhabitants were actually Italians, while in the Falkland Islands they are English, but here it is a matter of territory. So, the decision to do something before this blessed anniversary arrives is made by the people in charge in Argentina at that moment. The decision was made, as we know today, in December 1981. Who are the people in charge in Argentina at that moment? It doesn't take long for us to remember. That is the Argentina of the generals. It is the dictatorship of the generals. There is no need for me to tell you that it was one of the bloodiest dictatorships of the 20th century. The dictatorship of the dirty war, as they called it, the filthy war against the communists, the terrorists, the left in general, the dictatorship of the disappeared. There is still debate today about how many, but in any case, tens of thousands were made to disappear by this military junta. Now, in December, specifically during 81, the military junta, it is at a crossroads because the situation in Argentina is catastrophic and the popularity of the military dictatorship is at its lowest levels. The situation in Argentina is catastrophic for many reasons. First of all, it is catastrophic from an economic point of view. Inflation is at 600%. Poverty is widespread. Despite the military dictatorship, unions are in the streets every day protesting, even though every demonstration is repressed by the police. The economic crisis is coupled with the political crisis. The issue of the disappeared is coming to light, with the Madres de Plaza de Mayo, who have now become the grandmothers, if they are still alive, of May Square, demonstrating every Thursday in front of the Pink House, the presidential palace in Buenos Aires, asking where our children have gone. And even those demonstrations are repressed by the police, dispersed, and every Thursday they are back again. Essentially, Argentina is boiling. The military junta is shaky and no longer knows what to do. Indeed, the military junta carried out the coup by itself at the end of 1981. The dictator who was in power until that moment, General Viola, is deposed by another general who takes power with the consent of the majority of the military. This other general is named Leopoldo Galtieri. On December 22, 1981, General Galtieri took power in Argentina, proclaiming himself president for life of Argentina, with absolute powers and the authority to choose a successor. So who is he? A brief profile: who is General Galtieri? Like many Argentinians, he is the son of very poor Italian immigrants. Did you know that Argentina is a country half Italian? Half of Argentinians have at least one Italian ancestor. General Galtieri is a military figure of Italian origin who has made a career. How did Leopoldo Galtieri build his career? There is a crucial episode in his military career. In 1949, a young and promising lieutenant is chosen to attend a course at a particular school. In Panama, there is a school run by the United States military for officers of South American armies. School of the Americas. This School of the Americas in Panama is a school where young officers from the Chilean, Brazilian, Argentine, Peruvian, and Colombian armies are trained by US instructors. From what seems to be understood, it is not so much about waging war as it is about repression and counterinsurgency. Many dictators and collaborators of South American dictators passed through this school in Panama. Lieutenant Leopoldo Galtieri of the Argentine Army also goes through it. Here I tell you a gossip, but in my opinion it is just gossip. When Galtieri died about 10 years ago, the English newspaper The Economist published a scathing obituary in which, among other things, it states that Galtieri is the only officer in history who failed at the Panama School for South American officers. But this, I repeat, in my opinion, is a rumor from The Economist. It is not necessarily true. The fact is that Galtieri is advancing in his career, and when the military junta takes power in Argentina, Galtieri is one of the prominent figures and is one of the most visible characters even on an international level. At the beginning of 81, the coup d'etat took place in December, and he became president for life. 10 months earlier, he had been in the United States, received by Ronald Reagan, the President of the United States, with kisses and hugs. The United States is a friend of Argentina, especially since Argentina has adopted this policy of fierce anti-communism and suppresses leftist opposition internally. Reagan sees the regime of the generals and openly declares it a stronghold of anti-communism. Some of you were there yesterday. I have a déjà vu. Do you remember Lord Halifax, the English foreign minister, who in 1937 went to Berlin and told Hitler, certainly Germany, bastion of the ancient, well, history repeats itself in its own way from time to time. General Galtieri received me in Washington with enthusiasm. There is one of them. Various statements about how great this Argentine general is. A magnificent general, declares an unknown advisor of Reagan. There are different versions, but in short, a magnificent general. In December of that same year, 81, the magnificent general stages a coup d'etat, takes power in Argentina with the support of the admirals and generals he has made agreements with. We will do something that will set everything right. We will occupy the Falkland, indeed the Malvinas. We will occupy the Malvinas. The pact that brings Galtieri to power provides that in the coming months, this occupation of the Malvinas is planned with force. Based on this, I have always talked to you about bets in these series. Here too, there are two bets. The first bet is that the Argentine people have the news that the Malvinas have been occupied, liberated. The Malvinas will be crazy with enthusiasm, mad with patriotic delirium, and will forget about inflation, the disappeared, and so on. In their first bet, they come close to winning it because for a few days, this is exactly what will happen in Argentina. The second bet is that the world will accept the fait accompli. The English will never have the courage to react, and in any case, President Reagan is our friend. Consequently, he will ensure that there are no serious problems. The decision of the Argentine military is obviously secret at first. Nothing leaks out. Nothing leaks out also because in reality, for some years now, the impression is that the issue of the Falkland Malvinas is somewhat, resolving. You should know that for about 15 years there have been occasional Anglo-Argentine meetings in which the future of the Falkland is discussed. In these meetings, progress is made, agreements are reached, and Great Britain has never put the sovereignty over the islands on the table. However, the widespread feeling is that one day it might be possible to talk about it, and forms of co-management are accepted. Argentina also makes significant concessions, to be clear, because Argentina, in those years, since negotiations are taking place in a cordial atmosphere, it ensures air and sea connections with the Falkland, which would otherwise be completely isolated because Argentina is 500 kilometers away, but any other place in the world is thousands of kilometers from the Falkland. Therefore, there is a cordial atmosphere. The last meeting, these meetings take place in New York because it is the UN that has forced the British and Argentinians to negotiate. They meet in New York. The last meeting was in February 82. At the end of February 82, there is still a meeting and the final statement. You know that in diplomatic meetings, the language of the press release at the end is fundamental, from which one can understand how it went. The final statement says the meeting was cordial and friendly. This is at the end of February. On March 2nd, a statement from the Argentine government is released. The Argentine government declares that Argentina has negotiated with Great Britain on the issue of the sovereignty of the islands with patience, loyalty, and good faith for more than 15 years. Now enough is enough. Now the Argentinians say enough with such decisive meetings from time to time. We want, today one would say, a roadmap, although they didn't say it yet in 82. We want a precise deadline, a schedule of monthly meetings with the aim of transferring sovereignty over the islands to Argentina. England must tell us by when it will transfer sovereignty. The statement concludes like this. If this is not accepted, Argentina intends to end the negotiations and freely choose the procedure that best suits its interests. Diplomatic language is always so delicate, isn't it? But if one reads between the lines, the statement is from March 2nd. On March 3rd, the Argentine press loses its mind. The newspapers in Buenos Aires go wild, predicting the break of diplomatic relations with England. We could also cut communications to the Falkland, as they do without us, while we bring them medicine and supplies with our planes. The Argentine press says something that the Argentine government has not said. The Argentine government has said we need to set a date. The press goes further. England has 3 or 4 months to recognize Argentine sovereignty over the islands and set a date for their return. If not, the press says what the government has not said. We could also take back the islands. The Americans would understand. The British ambassador in Buenos Aires that morning took all the newspapers, transcribed the headlines and articles, and sent a telegram to London to the Prime Minister. On his copy of this very significant telegram, the Prime Minister in London notes, "We must make contingency plans." It is March 3rd, 82. The arrival of this news in London is a bolt from the blue. No one expected anything. This story is also partly a story of failures in intelligence and diplomacy. The British Foreign Office did not foresee anything. An English journalist explained it. The Foreign Office. The British Foreign Ministry is full of Arabists who are always ready to go and set things right in the Middle East. Instead, there is practically no one at any level who knows about South America or cares about it. So the Foreign Office thought of everything except that the Argentinians would enter a crisis over the Falkland Islands. The intelligence service is not only reassured, but will continue to reassure the Prime Minister throughout the month of March. Yes, the Argentinians, it is known that they are just people. They are half Italian, they talk, but they will never do anything. We have the reports now, so it is documented history. Her Majesty's Intelligence Service 007 is convinced that the Argentines are bluffing. The Prime Minister is a bit uneasy as well. The British Prime Minister, of course, is Mrs. Margaret Thatcher. The first woman I discuss in these lessons, the first woman I mention, let's see how she manages a crisis. It would be too easy to say, let's see if he behaves differently. Well, let's forget it. Keep in mind this. For the first time in history, perhaps since the time of Queen Elizabeth in the 1500s, it is a woman who will decide whether or not to go to war. But be careful, because Margaret Thatcher, who passed away last year, has now concluded her career and her life, has gone down in history, is a historical figure of great importance, who has influenced the world because Thatcher's reforms, the liberalizations, the fight against the unions, the destruction of union power, the end of nationalized industries, the privatizations, Thatcherism. She really changed the world. Everyone in their heart knows, both officially and openly, whether we should be happy or not about how Mrs. Thatcher changed the world. But certainly for us, she is a figure of enormous importance. In the spring of 1982, Mrs. Thatcher is not yet the one who has gone down in history. No one has yet won any of their battles. England is in an economic crisis. Thatcher has not defeated the unions. She has not privatized. She has failed to accomplish anything. And moreover, she is crushed, just as the English government was in 1914, by this enormous plague that England carries with it, which is Ireland. The crisis with Argentina over the Falkland Islands has erupted. Only a few months have passed since an event that we all remember, when the Northern Irish prisoners of the IRA began their hunger strike. Remember Bobby Sands, who sought better conditions and recognition as political prisoners and let themselves die of hunger one after another. 10 died from starvation, asking the English government to recognize them as political prisoners. And the English government, namely Margaret Thatcher, said, "No. A crime is a crime is a crime. Politics has nothing to do with it," signed Margaret Thatcher. At that moment, Thatcher is very weak. She hasn't done anything yet. And everyone predicts that she will lose the next elections. Among the many things to think about, there are also reports that the newspapers in Buenos Aires are going crazy over the Falkland Islands. But the intelligence services say not to worry. Mrs. Falkland, oh Mrs. Falkland, goodbye, Mrs. Thatcher is waiting. During the month of March, the Argentines strategically commenced to operate in the area to escalate tensions. So, I have to tell you something here, I told myself. I'll tell it. No, let's leave it out. No, but it's there. Because in March, only this happens that I'm about to tell you now. So, near the Falkland Islands, there is another archipelago, even more unfortunate, even colder, where no one lives, only penguins. It is called South Georgia and belongs to the British Crown. There is only just a naval platoon with a weather observation station. When I say that the islands of South Georgia are close to the Falkland Islands, you will laugh. They are 2,000 kilometers away from the Falkland Islands, but it is the closest piece of land anyway. Wah, there is nothing around. Go home and look at the map. The cosmic void. Therefore, South Georgia and the Falkland Islands belong to the same strategic area. Strange things begin to happen on these islands of South Georgia during the month of March. A group of Argentines lands. They are small groups of workers, and there is a contract for metal recovery. However, at a certain point, these Argentine workers raise the Argentine flag. The guarding Marines do not know exactly what to do. In fact, we now know that these Argentine workers are partly commandos from the army. Just a detail to remind us of the era, it may not be necessary. I will provide it anyway. The commander of this group of Argentine Marines disguised as workers who landed in South Georgia in March 1982 is an officer named Lieutenant Alfredo Astiz, who is currently serving a life sentence in Argentina, known for being one of the main torturers. Active in what was the main torture center in Buenos Aires, the Navy Mechanics School. And in March 1982, Lieutenant Alfredo Astiz temporarily suspends his activities at the Navy Torture Center to go land on South Georgia. Just to conclude, he is serving a life sentence, but only for a few years. Initially, he was sentenced to life in absentia by the French, because among the many people he tortured and killed were also 2 French nuns. Then finally, 3 years ago, the Argentines also sentenced him to life imprisonment. With a closing parenthesis, all this happens. And in London they say, what do the Argentines want? The intelligence services say they are worried about the Falkland Islands, but there is no danger before they decide to land. Thatcher thinks about negotiating, offering a negotiation to see what they say. She is not even that involved. The British Foreign Secretary is handling it. Let's open a small parenthesis. The British Foreign Secretary is Lord Carrington, who some may remember because he was also the Secretary General of NATO. Lord Carrington, Peter Carrington, he is a very loyal minister to Thatcher, a great friend, someone who feels her charisma strongly. He is one of the first to have recognized Thatcher as a formidable figure. There is a famous anecdote in England about a journalist who interviews Lord Carrington. And since Thatcher seems very weak, everyone is convinced that Thatcher will be out in the next elections. The journalist wants to ask Lord Carrington, his foreign minister, but if Thatcher falls, who will replace her in the Conservative Party? And Lord Carrington does not want to say. He says, no, she remains, it's not up for discussion. The journalist, finally impatient, says, fine, but let's suppose that tomorrow a bus hits Mrs. Thatcher. And Lord Carrington replies, the bus wouldn't have the courage to do that. Thus, Lord Carrington is a trusted man for Margaret, and the Foreign Office assures that there should be no problems. The first day the Foreign Office, led by Lord Carrington, begins to worry is March 24th. On that day, Lord Carrington sends a note to the Prime Minister and says, we are discussing whether we can negotiate with the Argentinians, but look at the climate. Their press keeps insulting us. I don't know if we can negotiate with someone who insults us and pressures us in this way. It may also be that we have to reach a confrontation. What would it mean to reach a confrontation? However, in the meantime, the Prime Minister is warned. Indeed, Lord Carrington arrived just in time. It is March 24th. We know today that on March 26th, Galtieri, the lifelong president of Argentina, initiates the invasion of the Falkland Islands. Operation Rosario. Landing plan in the Malvinas for April 2nd. No one knows, it's top secret. Thatcher has realized that tensions are rising. What do we do? What do you do when tensions rise? On one hand, they may keep saying, but let's negotiate. But how long will they continue to say that they are willing to negotiate? There comes a moment when you have to say, but look, we are serious about this. On March 29th, Mrs. Thatcher does what she can do. Orders the immediate departure of a nuclear submarine from Gibraltar to the Falkland Islands. The nuclear submarine will take 2 weeks to arrive at the Falkland Islands. Meanwhile, the news leaks to the press. Though it is unclear how, Mrs. Thatcher is very pleased that the press has found out. In his memoirs, he will say, "My instinct was that the time had come to show the Argentinians, as the English say, that we meant business, that we were serious." In short, the moment comes when we also need to show our muscles. Do you remember the things we talked about last night, the night before? Yes, it reminds me too. Fortunately, it's all much smaller, but Mrs. Thatcher is worried. Despite the guarantees from the Foreign Office, the intelligence services really note this down. But she writes in her memoirs, after the fact, so take it with a grain of salt, because in the memoirs, one might adjust things a bit. However, in the memoirs, she says, "I was worried because everyone assured me that the Argentinians would not invade. But we knew they were unpredictable and unstable." It is unclear whether she means these dictators or these Latins. It is known that a dictatorship does not always behave in ways that we would consider reasonable. Therefore, I was very uncertain, Thatcher later recalls. But I think none of us really expected the invasion of the Falkland Islands. Things escalate on the evening of March 31st. On the evening of March 31st, British Defence Minister John Nott requests an urgent meeting with Thatcher. They summon a few ministers. The Defence Minister rushes to Downing Street with a report from American intelligence, which has finally helped the English understand something. The American intelligence has very reliable news that evening of March 31st. The Argentine fleet is at sea, loaded with troops, and is heading towards the Falkland Islands. This meeting on the evening of March 31st is one of the decisive moments, of course. The English Defence Minister outlines the situation and tells Mrs. Thatcher that if the Argentinians occupy the islands, it is unthinkable to consider taking them back. We could never manage it. Thatcher's hair stands on end. How can we ever manage? It is completely out of the question. We must take them back if they land. And don't come to me saying that we can't do it. Where are the military? Where is the Admiral Chief of the Fleet General Staff? The Chief of Naval Staff Admiral has not yet arrived. Why hasn't Sir Henry Leach, the Chief of Staff of Her Majesty's Fleet, arrived? He doesn't arrive at the rendezvous. They finally discover this. He was in civilian clothes. He thought about cutting through Parliament. He was arrested while crossing Parliament, dressed in civilian clothes. Finally, a deputy recognized him, saying, "But it's the Admiral." And then they took him to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister asks the Admiral, "Is it conceivable to mount a mission to retake the Falkland Islands if they land?" The Admiral does some calculations and tells her, of course, it can be done. "I can send this aircraft carrier, that one, destroyers, frigates, I have them, I have that one, I have that one, I have everything. If you give the order, I will start assembling the fleet." Who can give the order? Does it require a vote from Parliament? Do they need to check? No. The Prime Minister can give it. It's not war. It's just assembling the fleet. That evening, the Prime Minister orders the Admiral to start gathering the fleet. And they say, well, maybe it would be better to discuss the order of departure in the Council of Ministers. But first, it is March 31st. The Argentine landing is scheduled for April 2. There is still a day and a half, 1 day, 2 nights. We absolutely have to do something to see if we can stop them. What do? We have already sent the nuclear submarine, so that's fine. How do we stop them? There is only one way in the post-World War II world. What would you have done? I call Big Brother. I call Ronald Reagan. Thatcher sends, not calls, but sends a telegram on the secure line to Reagan. Urgently. I read you the telegram from Thatcher to Reagan, the night of March 31st. Dear Ron, you will be aware of the disturbing information from our and your intelligence services, indicating that the Argentine Navy is preparing to invade the Falkland Islands within 48 hours. And among other things, can you urgently speak to the Argentine president and ask him not to authorize any landing? Best regards, Margaret. Then a new player enters the scene in the United States of America. The White House comes into play. Reagan calls Galtieri. Galtieri is not available. We've heard this before. Finally, Reagan insists. After a while, it's hard for him to say no. I'm calling you from the President of the United States. After a while, Galtieri responds, we have a direct source. It is the diary of a collaborator of Ronald Reagan named Jim Rentschler. It is the White House official who has been tasked with informing Reagan about this matter, what the Falkland Islands are, what is happening, and why he needs to call this Galtieri. The White House official, Jim Rentschler, while Reagan is on the phone with Galtieri, jots down some notes for his diary. He is a clever one who has already realized that the diary will be important, so he takes care of it. He has done well with the diary. Rentschler's diary continues while Reagan is on the phone. Rentschler notes down. It starts with a joke about the advertisement of the Bell Company, the American telephone company. There is this advertisement that says something like, just reach out your hand. And Rentschler writes, just reach out your hand. The Bell Company has never had any dealings with General Leopoldo Galtieri. And then he explains, the main collaborator of Reagan, he is the strongman of Argentina with whom the president is on the long-distance phone line with Buenos Aires right now to convince him to refrain from invading the Falkland Islands. Never heard of them, right? Neither had I until last night. This is the man who instructed the procedure for Ronald Reagan. I too did not know until last night when this request from the British Prime Minister arrived to prevent the Argentines from landing on these Falkland Islands. Then there is a judgment on Galtieri. Keep in mind, Galtieri is the man who was welcomed with open arms in Washington a year earlier, a magnificent general. Now Reagan's advisor is listening to the phone call and taking notes. This guy Galtieri, who isn't waiting for the interpreter, speaks first in a sort of mobster English. You understand, right? It could be an Italian, an Argentine. The English knows it just so-so. And what does it evoke for them? They've seen many TV dramas, right? With the mobster speaking with a Latin accent. This Galtieri, who speaks with this broken English in this kind of mafia boss English, has the look of a bandit. And Rentschler notes, the president is speaking with great eloquence. I admire him a lot, but I fear that the machismo of these Argentines will prevent him from stopping. Machismo. They have already made their decision and cannot lose face. They will go ahead. Reagan. Poor man, does what he can. Reagan is someone who, as it later turns out, declares to one of his assistants during those days, I don't understand why they are fighting so much over that little patch of cold land down there. Ice-cold bunch of land down there. But Reagan has one thing. When it's time to take a stand, he jumps in and takes it. You know why I told you that the Argentines made a precise calculation? We are good friends with the Americans. The Americans will not intervene and will ensure that no one else intervenes. Reagan discusses with his advisors that evening. There is someone who tells him, yes, indeed, let the Argentines do as they please. They are our friends. I don't know if you remember that politician, also a woman, American, named Jean Kirkpatrick. Mrs. Kirkpatrick, the United States ambassador to the UN and so on, who was famous, Mrs. Kirkpatrick. Regarding dictatorships, he said that all dictatorships are a bad thing. But there are recoverable regimes and those that are not recoverable. The non-recoverable ones are leftist regimes. Nothing can be done with them. Right-wing dictatorships are recoverable, and consequently, it is possible to get along with them. Mrs. Kirkpatrick would prefer to do nothing. America should stay out and let them handle it. As a side note, the day after, Mrs. Kirkpatrick will be the guest of honor at a lunch at the Argentine embassy. But the other advisor, Douglas Haig, Reagan's Secretary of State, holds an opposing view. We cannot let them go ahead. And Reagan agrees and concedes. And he writes to Dear Margaret, telegram from Reagan to Dear Margaret, Margaret's house. I have just spoken at length with General Galtieri about the situation in the Falkland Islands. I conveyed my personal concern about the possibility of an Argentine invasion to him. I told him that starting military operations would compromise offers of good offices, and so on and so forth. The general listened to me, but he did not make any commitments. In fact, it left me with the clear impression that they have now embarked on armed conflict, And Reagan concludes the telegram to Thatcher. While our policy on the issue of sovereignty over the Falkland Islands is one of neutrality, we will not be neutral if Argentina uses military force. So many good things wrong. Thatcher receives this telegram, which reveals that the Argentines are no longer stopping and that the Americans are not covering them. If the Argentinians really use force, the Americans will stand with us. At this point, the task gathers the government on the morning of April 2nd. The Argentines have already landed on the Falkland Islands, but they do not know it yet. The ambassador of the Falkland Islands sent a message, but it got lost on the plane and never arrived. A message will later arrive from a radio amateur in the Falkland Islands, which is intercepted by an English ship and retransmitted to London, thus informing London that the Argentines have occupied the Falkland Islands. The English government meets in the dark, knowing that the crisis is now inevitable. What to do? Thatcher informs her ministers that she has already ordered the assembly of a fleet. The fleet is now gathering. A decision will need to be made about whether to send it out. They discuss for a long time. In the meantime, they discuss many other things. An example of the details being discussed by the English government that Friday, April 2nd. The fleet will be led by the aircraft carrier Invincible. However, on the aircraft carrier Invincible, Prince Andrew, the son of the Queen, is serving as an officer. What happens if the aircraft carrier sets sail for war? Does Prince Andrew stay in his position, or is it better to keep him at home? Discussion between Downing Street and Buckingham Palace, the Queen expresses her opinion. Prince Andrew, as long as he is serving on the aircraft carrier Invincible, will participate in the mission. Her grandfather, King George VI, fought in the Battle of Jutland, and as a result, it is excluded that a member of the royal family could be treated differently from any other officer. A sigh of relief. With this problem resolved, Thatcher sees no other major issues. That evening, the government decides that the fleet will depart. In 2 days, as soon as it is ready, the fleet will set sail. This, although the Foreign Office is making a lot of fuss, in Thatcher's memoirs, her exasperation towards the Foreign Office is evident, which says, "They made a whole series of remarks to me." Thatcher says, "Note the Thatcher style," which demonstrated the flexibility of principles characteristic of that ministry. That is, it is a soft ministry because it thinks it is too cautious. They spoke to me about the risks for the English living in Argentina, the problem of obtaining support from the UN, the lack of trust in the European community and the United States, the risk of Soviet involvement, and the danger of being seen by the world as a colonial power. Thatcher says, "All true things, but when you are at war, you cannot allow difficulties to dominate your thoughts. You must move forward with the iron will to slightly overcome them." And anyway, what was the alternative? That some dictator, a mere puppet dictator, should govern the subjects of the Queen. And certainly prevail with deceit and violence, absolutely not. While I was Prime Minister, this is understood to be written afterwards, but in any case, the idea of the tequera is certainly that on April 2nd, when the Argentines have already landed, Reagan tries again and calls Galtieri. Galtieri responds, "England has refused to return the Falkland Islands for 149 years. Now the time has expired." In England, let us remember, Thatcher is a prime minister in crisis, unpopular, considered weak, who will lose the next elections. When the newspapers come out on April 3rd with the news that the Argentines have occupied the Falkland, the feeling in England is one of national humiliation. Another disaster has happened. We have made another fool of ourselves. The newspapers say it is the worst humiliation for England since Suez. What is Suez? 1956. The Egyptians nationalized the Suez Canal, which serves the British. The British send paratroopers to occupy the canal. The Americans tell the British to let it go, to go back home. And the British return home with their tails between their legs. In the English memory, it is the moment when England realizes that it is no longer a world power, indeed that it risks being ridiculous when it tries to intervene in the world. On that April 3rd of '82, the English newspapers say it is another Suez, and that day Thatcher must face Parliament. It is Saturday, And it is the first time in many decades that the English Parliament has been convened on a Saturday. The House of Commons is packed. Do you know what the House of Commons is like? It's small. There isn't a seat for every member, since they are never all present. And when they are all there, it's because something important is happening. And it's good that they are all crowded together, standing or sitting on the steps to listen to what is going on. Another characteristic of the English Parliament that we must remember, because we are used to our own, is that the English Parliament is one where many MPs vote as they think, rather than as the party dictates. It is perfectly normal in the English Parliament for cross-party majorities to form on important issues. Therefore, in the English Parliament, it is essential to convince the members, as it is a parliament where knowing how to make speeches is extremely important. Thatcher gives one of the great speeches of her career. Addressing Parliament, she says, "I believe you will all agree with me in condemning this aggression." It is an aggression, says Thatcher, that has not a shred of justification and not a bit of legality. Thatcher takes control of Parliament. There is only one moment when she risks losing it. He wants to do something nasty to the Labour Party. He wants to remind the Labour Party, the opposition, of some weaknesses they had when they were in government. And then she begins to say, "I can remind the honourable members of the opposition that they too, when they were in government," and a Labour MP interrupts, "we did not lose the Falkland." At that moment, the mood of the House of Commons wavers a bit, but Thatcher takes control of it. And in the end, Parliament votes in favour of the fleet's departure? Indeed. The fleet departs, is about to depart. Parliament has decided. Thatcher. In her memoirs, she says, "I was still terrified because the majority wasn't really there. That majority was fake. Someone like me was willing to go all the way to war. Many thought, let's send out the fleet. The Argentines will be scared. Negotiations will begin. Go all the way," says Thatcher. Only a few believe that. There are also those in Parliament who say, yes, now this lady looks good, but will this woman have the guts to go all the way? There is a speech that has remained famous in England. Let me tell you about it. We are all here to share stories, so I will tell you about it. A member of Parliament named Enoch Powell is a very famous politician in England, extremely popular. He is a sort of freelancer. He is on the right, a conservative, but he has left the Conservatives and is on his own. He is someone who has very anti-immigrant positions, for example, very nationalistic. But on other issues, he is leftist. He is a very bizarre character. Enoch Powell intervenes on that April 3rd in the House of Commons. And Thatcher remembers that while he was speaking, he looked at her intently and that he spoke in a sepulchral tone. In a sepulchral tone, Enoch Powell says, "The Prime Minister, shortly after coming to power, was nicknamed the Iron Lady, because this nickname was given to her right away. It was the Soviets who nicknamed her that, seeing the tough type she was. This nickname," says MP Powell, "was born in the context of relations with the Soviet Union and its allies, but there is reason to believe that the Honourable Lady was very pleased and indeed proud of this nickname. In the next week or two, this chamber, the nation, and the Honourable Lady herself will learn what metal she is made of." Here, Thatcher leaves Parliament with this wish and expectation. We will see what metal you are made of. It must be said that Thatcher knows she is in tune with the country more. Parliament is more determined than the Foreign Office to go all the way. There are polls, and the polls are very clear. 80% of the English respond that the Falkland Islands must be reclaimed. Then the second question is whether it is better to reclaim them through peaceful negotiation or by force. The majority of the English respond with force. Thus, Thatcher is in tune with her people. The fleet will depart. At this point, someone starts to say, but it's a war. Let's declare war. There is a meeting. We have these beautiful documents that I was telling you about, the minutes of the Conservative MPs Committee. Online, there is the transcript, as well as the original handwritten minutes, with doodles, underlinings, and the MPs, one after another, saying everything. There is also Lord Onslow, whose intervention is to sink their entire fleet. But most MPs, here is an MP who is concerned. There is an MP who says the people are worried about this thing that happened, and we must not appear weak. The Foreign Office stinks right now. It stinks of appeasement. Remember who was with you yesterday? What is appeasement? It is the name given in English politics to Chamberlain's attempt in 38-39 to placate Hitler by conceding many things to him. Appeasement, peace at any cost. In English political lexicon, it has become a dirty word. At that moment, in 82, some say, well, the Foreign Office continues to say we are negotiating. This smells of appeasement and is dangerous. Let's move on. However, then most MPs say we are at war. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, responds, no, there is no obligation to declare war. We are not at war. Other MPs insist on declaring war. Lord Carrington finds it difficult to declare war. There are legal difficulties. We need to consult the lawyers. And this is on record. In fact, this covers up the fact that the government has decided that declaring war would be an unnecessary complication. These are truly new times, because the men of 14 and even those of 39 were concerned with sending the ambassador with the declaration of war, perhaps full of lies, but they sent it. Instead, now times have changed. Now they are perhaps more cynical or more pragmatic, maybe a bit smarter, perhaps all in all. You will know all this together. But there is no reason to declare war, Mrs. Thatcher officially reiterates 2 days later, on April 5th. Interview with Mrs. Thatcher, the journalist asks, but is she really about to go to war with Argentina? Thatcher, our goal is to recover the Falkland Islands. We must do what is necessary to achieve this. I would not speak in terms of war. A declaration of war is something different. We will not go into technical details. We must recover the Falkland Islands for Great Britain and for the people who live there. We do not say it is war. It is not. A declaration of war is technically different. I am always quoting verbatim from the interview. Do not insist on the technical aspects. We know what we have to do. There are many different ways to achieve it. We hope we haven't chosen the worst one. When you stop a dictator, there are always risks. But there are many great risks in not stopping dictators. My generation learned this a long time ago. And here, of course, we must reflect on this aspect. The generations knew Thatcher well, but now she is dead and was very old. Thatcher lived through the Second World War, the appeasement, and Hitler, and in 82, these were still events she had experienced and remembered well. And so the influence of what happened in 39 intervenes in 82. What should England do in front of the dictator? Try to stop him. And to come out of it with shame, like at Munich, that is, not to try to stop it, must stop it. The Foreign Office, as you know, was not in agreement. In fact, on April 5th, Lord Carrington resigned, stating, "It was my ministry that was supposed to handle this crisis. We did not succeed. We are at war, and I feel on my honor that I must resign." Now, Lord Carrington was a dear friend of Mrs. Thatcher, a loyal collaborator, but politics is what it is. Now I will tell you the reaction of Mrs. Thatcher when she is interviewed about the fact that her Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, has resigned. Mrs. Thatcher says, "It was a severe blow for me. I am very sorry to lose him. He was a valuable man for my government. But what can you do? He has felt that he was responsible, that his ministry was responsible for managing the crisis. The management has failed, and therefore he felt it was a matter of honor to resign. I am very sorry." And then she says, Thatcher, "But you know, it is truly wonderful to have people in politics who feel so strongly about honor and who resign when the time comes. And so, exit Lord Carrington." Oh, it's almost over, huh? I'm not telling you about the war. I'm just telling you how Margaret decided to send out the fleet. Then for a month, the Americans will try to shuttle between the Argentines and the English, saying to stop. Everyone remains firm in their positions, and the war arrives. However, in Argentina, well before the English landing and the war, morale collapses. The Argentine press continues to say we are ready, we are waiting for them, but especially at high levels in Argentine society, panic is spreading. We have a secret report from the American intelligence services, a testimony from a high-ranking Argentine politician who was a member of the military junta, who supports the military junta, and who tells his American confidant, this Argentine politician, it's now or never, meaning if we end up keeping the Falkland, great. If not, Galtieri falls. We cannot start negotiating now. It would be worse. Galtieri would fall immediately. For him, it is better to lose the war. And the American observer notes that, in any case, my Argentine interlocutor is sure that Argentina will lose. There is no politician in the country who does not think that the invasion was a colossal mistake. There is an awareness that the president and his advisors are incompetent. And then there is this thing that I, being an Italian, found fascinating. The Argentine politician speaks to the American. He told us that he is now 41 years old and that he knows he will never see a serious Argentina in his lifetime. The beauty of it is that the American doesn't understand what it means, he explains. He means a stable, democratic, and prosperous country. But as an Italian, I understand perfectly what an Argentine thinks when he says, but why is my country not serious? Will I ever see a serious country? This Argentine says no. Perhaps my children will see a country, a serious Argentina. I have understood that I will not see it anymore. In fact, the war ends, as you know. In just a few weeks, the English win, and they win decisively. The war costs 1,000 lives, 649 Argentines, 258 English, and 3 civilians from the Falkland. A war that was never declared, right? So there is no need to make a peace treaty. It was something, it happened, but it is not declared, it leaves no trace. It leaves no trace. It has beautiful consequences. On June 14th, the Argentine flag is lowered in Port Stanley, and the last Argentine troops surrender. 4 days later, on June 18th, Galtieri resigns. They send another general trying to keep the dictatorship afloat, but they fail. The situation is such that the military junta is forced to call for free elections. Remember, Alfonsín becomes the president of Argentina. The military dictatorship ends. Galtieri will be in prison from 86 to 91. Then he is pardoned, and later he is put on trial again. In 2002, he suffers a heart attack and then dies under house arrest, as often happens with elderly politicians who are accused. When Galtieri died in 2003, The Economist published that obituary I mentioned at the beginning, scathing, in which it states, among other things, Galtieri, perhaps some of his compatriots could forgive him for his ruthlessness, but not for his stupidity. Thus, the Falkland War brings down the Argentine military junta and creates Mrs. Thatcher. Because the turning point in Margaret Thatcher's political career is the Falkland War. The day after, Thatcher is the strongest politician that there has been in the United Kingdom for a long time. She wins the elections of '83 and does everything she does, for better or for worse, depending on how each of us thinks. That MP Enoch Powell, who intervened in Parliament saying that in the coming weeks, the country will see what metal the Prime Minister is made of. You know how the English are and how their parliament works. In a subsequent session after the end of the war, Deputy Powell takes the floor and declares, I would like to inform the Prime Minister that I have here the report from an analysis institute on a certain substance whose composition had been discussed. And it turns out that the substance in question is iron of the highest quality, extremely resistant to tension and suitable for any use in the interest of the country. And Mrs. Thatcher indeed becomes Mrs. Thatcher. And a few weeks later, in an official speech, she says this thing. What really excited me, after spending so much of my life in Parliament discussing things like inflation, family allowances, housing issues, environmental problems, and so on, when the moment of truth came, what excited the people were not those things. What truly excited the people was the fact of being able to serve a great cause again, the cause of freedom. Perhaps she would have been more sincere if she had said that what excited people was being at war again. However, she also had a way of framing it that ultimately served the cause of freedom. Here, like many things about Margaret Thatcher, this statement, and in general her management of the Falkland crisis, can either excite some or send chills down the spine of others, or perhaps both at the same time, which is ultimately the effect it had on me. So here we are, looking back over these 3 evenings at how wars break out, how it has taught me many things. It has also electrified me, excited me, and given me chills, seeing how wars start, how politicians manage crises, and I hope it has happened the same for you. Thank you, and see you next year. Thank you and goodbye.